London, 1851, and the conservatory of the Dashwood townhouse in Mayfair stood like a crystal palace at the edge of the world, its glass walls fogged with the unseasonable warmth of late April and the breath of a woman learning to die without making a sound. Lady Emmeline Dashwood pressed her hand against her mouth with such force that her teeth cut into the soft flesh of her lower lip, the taste of copper blooming on her tongue as tears streamed down her face in absolute silence, each drop falling like a stone into still water, making no ripple, no disturbance, no evidence of the catastrophe unfolding behind her ribs. She was 26 years old and had perfected this particular skill over 2 decades of careful training, the art of weeping without sound, without movement, without any outward sign that might disturb the perfect surface of propriety that her mother demanded like other women demanded tea at 4 o'clock. Through the glass walls that surrounded her like a fishbowl on display, she could see the garden below where her betrothed, Viscount Edmund Whitmore, had his mouth pressed against the lips of her cousin Lydia, his hand tangled in those golden curls that Emmeline had always secretly envied, their bodies pressed together beneath the ancient oak tree with an urgency that spoke of practice, of repetition, of a passion that had clearly existed long before this moment. The candlelight from the ballroom behind her cast dancing shadows across the conservatory floor, illuminating her mother's prize orchids that surrounded Emmeline like beautiful prisoners. Exotic blooms imported from the far reaches of the empire, each one requiring such perfect conditions to survive. Too much heat, and they withered. Too much cold, and they died, never allowed to simply exist without constant vigilance and control. The scent of jasmine hung in the air, thick and cloying, sickly sweet in a way that made her stomach turn, and she knew with terrible certainty that she would never smell that particular fragrance again without remembering this exact moment, this precise configuration of pain. Her other hand gripped the iron frame of the conservatory door, knuckles white against the dark metal, holding herself upright through sheer force of will, because ladies of quality did not collapse, did not swoon, did not make unseemly displays of emotion even when their entire future crumbled before their eyes like sand castles before the tide. Edmund's voice drifted up through the open window, clear and unconcerned, speaking words that carved themselves into her memory with the precision of a surgeon's blade. "Emmeline is biddable and rich," he said to Lydia, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather or the quality of the wine being served inside. "You are beautiful and exciting. Why should I not have both?" The casual cruelty of it stole what little breath Emmeline had managed to retain, and she watched as Lydia laughed, that tinkling sound that men always found so charming, watched as her cousin, her own blood, looked up at Edmund with adoration and asked, "When we marry, will you still keep me?" Edmund's response came quickly, practiced, as though he had considered this question before. "Marriage to Emmeline is a business arrangement," he said, brushing a golden curl from Lydia's face with a tenderness he had never once shown his intended bride. "You are my pleasure." Inside the ballroom, guests laughed and toasted, celebrating an engagement that Emmeline now understood was nothing more than a financial transaction, her worth measured not in her accomplishments or character, but in the size of her dowry and the desperation of her family's debts. She could hear them through the walls, the cream of London society, toasting her happiness, congratulating her mother on such an advantageous match, never knowing that the bride stood mere feet away, dying silently while they drank champagne and gossiped about other people's misfortunes. This was not the first time Edmund had humiliated her, Emmeline realized with a clarity that felt like ice water in her veins, but it was the first time she had witnessed it so directly, so undeniably, without the buffer of rumor or the softening lens of her own desperate hope that he might somehow transform into the husband she deserved. For months, she had heard whispers about his visits to certain establishments, about late nights at gambling hells, about debts that mounted faster than his allowance could cover, but her mother had dismissed such concerns with a wave of her hand, insisting that all young men sowed wild oats before settling into marriage, that Emmeline's role was to provide stability and respectability while turning a blind eye to masculine indiscretions that were, after all, simply the natural order of things. A memory flashed through her mind with the violence of lightning, bright and painful and impossible to ignore. Herself, at 8 years old, standing beside her father's grave as rain poured down and grief tore through her small body like a physical force, the sound of her own wailing echoing across the cemetery until her mother's hand cracked across her face hard enough to knock her sideways, the sharp command cutting through her tears. "Dashwoods do not wail like common servants," her mother had hissed, gripping Emmeline's arm hard enough to bruise. "You will be silent, you will be still, and you will comport yourself with the dignity befitting your station." The lesson had been reinforced again and again throughout her childhood, each display of emotion met with punishment, each tear earning disapproval, until Emmeline learned to swallow her feelings like bitter medicine, to compress her pain into something small and manageable that could be hidden away where no one would ever have to acknowledge its existence. "Breathe," she told herself now, the internal mantra automatic after so many years of practice. Silent. Still. No one must know. Her chest heaved with suppressed anguish, her entire body trembling with the effort of containing the scream that wanted to tear itself from her throat. But no sound emerged, not even a whimper, because she had been so thoroughly trained in the art of suffering quietly that it had become as natural as breathing. The fog on the conservatory glass grew thicker with each silent sob, her breath creating clouds of condensation that obscured the garden scene below, a small mercy that allowed her to finally close her eyes without seeing the ongoing embrace, though the image was already burned into her mind with perfect clarity. She had spent her entire life preparing for this marriage, had molded herself into exactly the sort of wife a man like Edmund Whitmore would need, accomplished in all the appropriate arts, fluent in French and Italian, able to manage a household with efficiency and grace, trained in watercolors and pianoforte, and the precise gradations of courtesy required by every possible social situation. And yet none of it mattered, because she was not young enough, not beautiful enough, not exciting enough to inspire the sort of passion that Edmund reserved for women like Lydia. The orchids surrounding her seemed to mock her with their fragile beauty, each bloom perfect and precisely maintained, just as she had been groomed and cultivated for this singular purpose, to be a decoration in some man's house, valuable only as long as she remained beautiful and quiet and required nothing that might inconvenience the people around her. Her lip continued to bleed where her teeth had broken the skin, a tiny rebellion of the body against the iron control she maintained over everything else. And she tasted salt, mixing with copper as tears ran into her mouth, evidence of her weakness that she quickly swallowed down, erasing the proof of her pain as thoroughly as she erased the sound of it. Beyond the conservatory walls, the party continued in blissful ignorance, her mother holding court in the ballroom, no doubt regaling guests with stories of the advantageous match she had secured for her difficult daughter, the one who read too much and thought too much, and had never quite mastered the art of simpering charm that came so naturally to girls like Lydia. Edmund and Lydia remained in the garden, and Emmeline wondered with a detached sort of curiosity how long they would stay there, how long until someone noticed their absence, whether anyone would think to look for the bride herself, standing alone among the orchids like one more exotic specimen in her mother's collection. The jasmine scent grew stronger, Or perhaps she was simply more aware of it now that it had been consecrated by catastrophe, transformed from mere fragrance into a permanent memorial of this moment when she understood with perfect clarity that her life would be exactly what she had been raised to expect. A beautiful cage, a silent suffering, a slow death by inches while maintaining a pleasant expression and appropriate posture. She wanted to scream, wanted to shatter the glass walls around her and let the broken shards rain down like tears made solid, wanted to run into the garden and demand that Edmund explain how he could kiss another woman on the night of his own engagement celebration, wanted to slap Lydia's beautiful face and ask how she could betray family so casually, but instead she stood perfectly still, hand pressed against her bleeding mouth, tears flowing in absolute silence. Because this was what she had been trained for. This was the purpose of every lesson and punishment and careful correction, to create a woman who could endure anything without disturbing the peace of those around her with unseemly displays of emotion. The enormity of it settled over her like a physical weight, the understanding that this moment was not an aberration but a preview, that if she married Edmund Whitmore in 3 weeks as planned, she would spend the rest of her life standing in metaphorical conservatories, watching through glass walls as he pursued his pleasures elsewhere, while she maintained the fiction of a proper marriage, producing heirs and managing households and attending social functions with a pleasant smile that never wavered, never revealed the screaming silence that lived inside her bones. But for now, in this moment, in this glass prison filled with carefully controlled beauty and the sickening scent of jasmine, Lady Emmeline Dashwood did what she had been trained to do since childhood. She breathed, she remained silent, she stayed perfectly still, and she let no one know that behind her calm exterior she was dying without making a sound. The ballroom glittered with 1,000 candles reflected in gilt-framed mirrors that lined every wall, creating an infinite multiplication of the scene, of the guests in their finest silks and jewels, of the champagne fountains and elaborate floral arrangements, and most cruelly, of Emmeline herself, trapped in glass over and over again, each reflection showing a woman she barely recognized, powder carefully applied to hide the redness around her eyes, posture perfect despite the trembling that lived beneath her skin, a smile fixed in place like something painted on porcelain. She had taken 15 minutes in the conservatory after Edmund and Lydia finally separated and returned to the house through different entrances, 15 minutes to transform herself from a woman dying silently among the orchids back into the perfect bride, using the small compact she always carried to repair the damage tears had done to her complexion, biting her already wounded lip again to bring color back to her face, pressing cold fingers against her closed eyelids to reduce the swelling, breathing in measured counts until her heart rate slowed to something approaching normal. Lady Catherine Dashwood found her the moment she re-entered the ballroom, her mother's thin fingers wrapping around Emmeline's arm with a grip that looked like maternal affection but felt like iron manacles, nails digging into the soft flesh above her elbow hard enough to leave crescent-shaped marks that would bloom into bruises by morning. "There you are, darling," her mother said, voice honey-sweet for the benefit of the guests who turned to look at them. "I have been searching everywhere for you. The Duchess of Tilney is most eager to offer her congratulations." Emmeline allowed herself to be steered across the ballroom floor, her body moving automatically through the familiar motions while her mind floated somewhere above the scene, watching with detached curiosity as she curtsied to the Duchess, as she smiled and nodded and offered all the appropriate responses to questions about wedding preparations and future plans, her voice steady and pleasant, giving no indication that 20 minutes earlier she had witnessed her betrothed kissing another woman with a passion he had never shown his intended bride. The Duchess of Tilney, an imposing woman of 70 with diamonds dripping from her neck and ears, looked Emmeline up and down with the assessing gaze of someone evaluating livestock at market. "You have done well, Catherine," she pronounced to Lady Catherine, ignoring Emmeline entirely, as though the bride herself were merely another decoration in the room. "The Whitmore connection will restore your family's standing considerably, though I must say I am surprised Edmund settled on this one when the younger girl is so much prettier." Emmeline felt her mother's grip tighten painfully on her arm, warning her to remain silent, to absorb the insult with grace, to maintain the pleasant expression that was expected of well-bred young ladies who knew their place. "Emmeline has other qualities that recommend her," Lady Catherine said smoothly, her voice never wavering despite the cutting nature of the comment. "She is biddable, sensible, and has been trained to manage a great household, qualities that matter far more in a wife than mere prettiness, which fades with time." The Duchess nodded approvingly, and Emmeline stood perfectly still, a specimen on display, while the two older women discussed her merits and deficiencies as though she were not present, as though she had no thoughts or feelings about being described as biddable and sensible, as though the reduction of her entire existence to her usefulness as a wife and household manager was perfectly natural and required no acknowledgement of the person trapped inside this role. Edmund returned to the ballroom some 30 minutes after Lydia had slipped back in through the terrace doors, his cravat slightly askew, his hair mussed in a way that suggested fingers had run through it, his colour high and his eyes bright with the satisfaction of recent pleasure, and when he caught sight of Emmeline across the room, he smiled at her with easy confidence, clearly unconcerned that she might have noticed his absence or drawn any conclusions from it. He crossed, too, her side with the casual arrogance of a man who had never once been denied anything he wanted, and Emmeline watched him approach in the mirrors, seeing the scene multiplied endlessly, Edmund reaching for her hand, Edmund bowing over it with exaggerated gallantry, Edmund tucking her arm through his and leading her toward the center of the ballroom where space had been cleared for dancing. The orchestra struck up a waltz, the music too loud, pounding in her head like a heartbeat, and Edmund pulled her into the dance with hands that gripped too tightly, his palm pressing against her waist with possessive force, his other hand crushing her fingers in his grasp until she could feel the bones grinding together. "You look lovely tonight, my dear," he murmured, pulling her closer than propriety strictly allowed, close enough that she could smell brandy on his breath and something else, some feminine scent that clung to his coat. Jasmine, perhaps, or maybe she was imagining it. Maybe the scent from the conservatory had embedded itself so deeply in her senses that she would smell it everywhere now, a permanent reminder of her humiliation. She said nothing, merely maintained her pleasant expression and followed his lead through the steps of the waltz, her body moving mechanically through the familiar pattern, while her mind retreated to that floating place above the scene, watching this woman in pale blue silk being steered around the dance floor like a puppet whose strings were pulled by unseen hands. "I have been thinking about our wedding night," Edmund continued, his voice lowering to a whisper meant only for her ears, his breath hot against her temple. "I hope you understand what will be expected of you, what a wife's duties entail. I trust your mother has explained the particulars, though I find the innocent ones often require more forceful instruction." His hand slid lower on her waist, skating the edge of impropriety, and Emmeline felt tears gathering behind her eyes again, hot and unwelcome, but she blinked them back, breathed through the tightness in her chest, kept her smile fixed in place because crying would draw attention, and attention would displease her mother, and displeasing her mother would result in consequences she had learned long ago to avoid. "I am sure everything will be as it should be," she replied, her voice perfectly modulated, giving away nothing of the horror and disgust churning in her stomach at his crude implications. At the promise of violation disguised as marital rights. Edmund seemed pleased by her response, by her compliance, by the absolute certainty that she would accept whatever he chose to do to her without complaint or resistance. And he pulled her even closer, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body through the layers of fabric separating them, close enough that anyone watching would note the intimacy and smile approvingly at the evident passion between the engaged couple. As they turned past one of the large mirrors, Emmeline caught sight of her own face and was startled by what she saw. The pleasant smile was still in place, perfect and practiced, but beneath her lowered lashes, tears had leaked silently down her powdered cheeks, twin trails of moisture catching the candlelight as they fell. The Duchess of Tilney, standing at the edge of the dance floor, noticed the tears and leaned toward her companion with a sentimental smile. "Look at the dear girl," she said loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "so overcome with joy that she weeps. How touching to see a bride so affected by her good fortune." Emmeline heard the comment and felt something crack inside her chest, some fragile thing that had been holding her together through sheer force of will. But her feet continued to move through the waltz. Her posture remained perfect. Her expression never wavered, because she had been trained too well, conditioned too thoroughly to break down simply because her heart was shattering into pieces too small to ever reassemble. The waltz ended, and Edmund led her from the floor toward a small raised platform at the far end of the ballroom where a quartet played between dances, and with growing dread, Emmeline realized what was about to happen. Realized that Edmund intended to make some sort of announcement, though he had not consulted her, had not asked her preference, had simply decided as he decided everything, with the absolute confidence of a man who had never once considered that a woman might have opinions worth considering. He raised his hand for silence, and the room gradually quieted, hundreds of faces turning toward them with curiosity and anticipation, and Emmeline stood beside him, her hand still trapped in his crushing grip, her face composed into pleasant attention, while her mind screamed soundlessly behind the mask. "My dear friends," Edmund began, his voice carrying easily across the now silent ballroom, "I am delighted to announce that Lady Emmeline Dashwood has done me the great honor of accepting my proposal of marriage, and I am further pleased to announce that the wedding will take place 3 weeks hence, on the 22nd of May, at St. George's in Hanover Square." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd, 3 weeks being unusually short, even by the standards of the day, suggesting either unseemly haste or impending financial necessity. But Edmund pressed on, undeterred by the whispers. "I find I cannot wait a moment longer than necessary to make this remarkable woman my wife," he said, the lie so smooth and practiced that Emmeline almost believed he meant it, almost forgot that less than an hour ago he had been kissing her cousin in the garden while describing their impending marriage as merely a business arrangement. She knew the real reason for the haste, had overheard her mother discussing it with the family solicitor just last week. The Dashwood debts were more severe than Emmeline had realized, creditors were circling, and the marriage settlement from the Whitmore family was desperately needed to stave off complete financial ruin. 3 weeks was not romance, but survival, not passion, but panic, not choice, but necessity. The guests applauded politely, and Edmund turned to her, clearly expecting some response, some pretty speech about her happiness and gratitude. And Emmeline felt every eye in the room fixed upon her, felt the weight of expectation pressing down like a physical force, felt her mother's iron grip still on her arm, warning her wordlessly to perform her role perfectly, to seal this arrangement with appropriate sentiment, to make no trouble. She curtsied deeply, the movement automatic after years of training, and when she rose, her voice emerged steady and clear, carrying across the silent ballroom with perfect diction. "I am most sensible of the honor Lord Whitmore does me," she said, the words emerging as though from someone else's mouth, some other woman who was not dying inside this beautiful dress. And I accept with gratitude the arrangement our families have made. I trust that I shall endeavor to be a credit to his name and fulfill all duties expected of me as his wife. It was a speech calculated to please everyone, appropriately humble, properly deferential, giving no hint of reluctance or despair. And indeed the guests seemed satisfied, applauding again with more enthusiasm now that the bride had publicly accepted her fate. Lady Catherine beamed with triumph, Edmund looked smugly satisfied, and Emmeline stood perfectly still, smiling pleasantly, while something inside her withered and died. Some last small hope that perhaps there might be another way, another future, another possibility beyond this slow suffocation disguised as matrimony. As the orchestra resumed playing and guests pressed forward with congratulations, Emmeline found herself swept into a receiving line of sorts, shaking hands and accepting kisses on her cheek from people she barely knew, all of them offering wishes for her happiness while she mechanically thanked them, her responses automatic, requiring no conscious thought, leaving her mind free to drift away from the scene, to retreat into that quiet place where the pain could not quite reach her. Edmund had moved away to accept congratulations from his friends, and as she performed her social duties, Emmeline could hear fragments of their conversation, could hear Edmund's voice rising above the others in self-satisfied boasting. "She is plain but properly trained," he said, and Emmeline felt the words land like blows even as her smile never wavered. "The quiet ones are easiest to manage, you know. No tiresome dramatics or emotional outbursts. She will run the household efficiently and produce heirs without complaint, exactly the sort of wife a man needs when he wishes to maintain his freedom elsewhere." His friends laughed, offering ribald commentary about the benefits of a compliant wife, and Emmeline absorbed it all, each crude comment, each casual dismissal of her worth, each confirmation that she was nothing more than a convenient solution to his financial difficulties and her family's debts. A transaction rather than a partnership, a possession rather than a person. The evening stretched on endlessly, hours passing in a blur of champagne toasts and congratulatory speeches, and through it all, Emmeline maintained her composure, her pleasant expression never slipping, her voice never betraying the screaming silence inside her, until finally, mercifully, she was able to excuse herself to the ladies' retiring room, claiming a need to refresh her appearance before the final hour of dancing. The retiring room was blissfully empty, a small chamber off the main hallway decorated in soft pink silk with a chaise longue and dressing table. And the moment the door closed behind her, Emmeline collapsed onto the chaise, her legs finally giving out, her body folding in on itself as though trying to make herself as small as possible, small enough to disappear entirely. Tears came again, flowing freely now that she was alone, streaming down her face in total silence, her chest heaving with suppressed sobs that she dared not release even here, even in privacy, because the habit of silence was so deeply ingrained that she could not break it even when no one was watching. She stared at her reflection in the dressing-table mirror, seeing a stranger looking back, a woman in an expensive gown with elaborate hair and perfect cosmetics. A woman who looked like a bride, like someone anticipating joy, and the disconnect between the image and the reality was so vast that Emmeline felt dizzy with it, felt as though she were splitting in two, the performance and the person, the mask and the truth, the silent exterior and the screaming interior. Her mother's words from earlier that evening echoed in her mind, spoken in a moment when they had been briefly alone, low and vicious in Emmeline's ear. "You will marry Edmund Whitmore," Lady Catherine had hissed, fingers digging into Emmeline's arm hard enough to bruise. "Our family's debts require it. Your feelings are irrelevant. You have been raised for this purpose, and you will fulfill it. I will not allow your selfishness to destroy everything I have worked to preserve." Emmeline had understood in that moment, if she had not fully grasped it before, that there was no escape, no alternative, no possibility of refusal, because she had no money of her own, no skills that might allow her to support herself, no relatives who might take her in if she defied her mother's will, nowhere to go and no means of getting there. Even if such a place existed, she was as thoroughly trapped as if she had been locked in a cell, the bars made not of iron but of social expectation and economic necessity, and a lifetime of conditioning that had taught her to accept her powerlessness as natural and inevitable. She sat alone in the retiring room for perhaps 10 minutes, letting the tears flow in silence, making no sound, even though no one could hear her, because the silence was so deeply embedded in her bones that she no longer knew how to cry any other way. And when finally the tears slowed and stopped, she rose and repaired her face again, powdering over the evidence of her grief, painting her smile back into place, transforming herself once more into the perfect bride who would return to the ballroom and dance and smile and accept congratulations until the party finally ended, and she could retreat to her room and lie awake in the darkness, counting down the days until her wedding, until the moment when this beautiful prison would become permanent and inescapable, when she would be bound by law and custom to a man who saw her as property, as convenience, as something to be managed rather than loved. And there would be no more conservatory escapes, no more moments of private grief, only an endless performance of contentment while she died by inches, silently, invisibly, exactly as she had been trained. The first pale fingers of dawn were just beginning to reach through the tall windows of the Dashwood Library when Emmeline slipped through its heavy oak door, closing it softly behind her, as though afraid to disturb the sleeping books that lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their leather spines gleaming in the growing light, like 1,000 patient friends waiting to offer comfort that humans had failed to provide. She had not slept at all after the engagement party finally ended near midnight, had lain in her bed staring at the canopy above her while her mind replayed every humiliation of the evening in excruciating detail. Edmund's hands gripping too tightly during their waltz, his crude whispers about her wedding night, the casual cruelty of his conversation with friends where he described her as plain but properly trained, easy to manage, a convenient wife who would not interfere with his pursuit of pleasure elsewhere, and beneath it all, the image of him kissing Lydia in the garden. The passion in that embrace throwing into sharp relief the complete absence of any such feeling in his interactions with his intended bride. The library had always been her refuge, the one room in the sprawling Mayfair townhouse where she was allowed something approaching privacy, where her mother rarely ventured because Lady Catherine considered reading beyond the occasional novel a waste of time that might give a young woman inappropriate ideas about her place in the world. Here, surrounded by the smell of leather and paper and dust, by the weight of knowledge accumulated over centuries, Emmeline could breathe more freely than anywhere else, could allow her mind to wander beyond the narrow confines of what was considered appropriate for a lady of quality, could lose herself in worlds and ideas that had nothing to do with managing households or pleasing husbands or maintaining the sort of pleasant, undemanding presence that men, like Edmund, required in their wives. She had chosen a seat in the window alcove where morning light was just beginning to stream through the glass, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny stars, and she had pulled from the shelf one of her secret treasures, a medical text on human anatomy that she had hidden behind a row of poetry volumes years ago, knowing her mother would confiscate it if discovered, would lecture her about the unseemliness of a young lady studying the physical workings of the body, particularly the sections dealing with male and female differences that were considered far too indelicate for unmarried women to contemplate. This morning she had opened the book to the section on the human ear, fascinated as always by the intricate machinery of hearing, the way sound waves travelled through air and vibrated against the eardrum, setting in motion a chain of tiny bones with names like poetry, malleus, incus, stapes, hammer, anvil, stirrup, each one smaller than a grain of rice, yet essential to the miracle of hearing. The way these vibrations were then translated into electrical signals that the brain could interpret as music or speech or the rustle of wind through leaves. As she read, tears began to fall again. Silently as always, dropping onto the pages before her and blurring the careful anatomical drawings, but she made no move to wipe them away, allowed them to flow freely for the first time since the conservatory, since witnessing Edmund's betrayal, since understanding with perfect clarity that her future held nothing but a lifetime of silent suffering, of swallowing her feelings, of dying by inches while maintaining a pleasant expression that gave no hint of the screaming that lived inside her bones. She did not hear the library door open, lost as she was in her reading and her grief, did not notice the tall figure that entered until a shadow fell across her book, and she looked up with a start to find a man standing before her, his dark hair slightly dishevelled from the morning wind, his grey eyes studying her face with an intensity that should have been unsettling but somehow was not, his expression one of concern rather than the polite indifference she was accustomed to seeing in men's faces when they looked at her. He was perhaps 32 years old, with strong features that missed being handsome by a narrow margin, but possessed something more interesting than mere beauty, a quality of presence and attention that made him seem more real, more solid than the parade of eligible bachelors she had been introduced to over the years, men who looked through her rather than at her, who saw only her dowry and her family name, and her suitability as a decorative addition to their households. The man made no sound as he approached, moving with a careful deliberation that she would later understand was characteristic of someone who could not hear his own footsteps, could not gauge the noise he made in the world, and he stopped perhaps 3 feet from where she sat, frozen in the window alcove, her anatomy book still open on her lap, tears still streaming down her face, though she had made no sound, had given no outward indication of distress beyond the moisture on her cheeks that caught the morning light like crystal. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a small leather notebook and a pencil, wrote something quickly, then held it out for her to read, his grey eyes never leaving her face, watching with that same intense attention as though he were reading something written in her expression that no one else had ever bothered to look for. The note said simply, in a bold, clear hand that suggested education and confidence, "I am Frederick Wentworth, Duke of Wentworth, and I apologize for intruding on your privacy, but I cannot help but notice that you are in distress, though you make no sound, which strikes me as the saddest thing I have witnessed in some time. May I be of assistance?" Emmeline stared at the note, then at the man, confusion and shock momentarily overriding her grief, wondering who this stranger was, and why he was in her family's library at dawn, why he was communicating through written notes rather than speech, why he had noticed her tears when every other person at last night's engagement party had looked directly at her weeping face and seen only what they expected to see, a joyful bride overcome with happiness rather than a trapped woman dying silently behind a mask of propriety. She took the pencil he offered and wrote beneath his words, her hand shaking slightly, "You are the Duke of Wentworth. Our families share a solicitor, Mr. Gardiner. He must have double-booked the library for meetings this morning. I apologize. I did not realize anyone else would be here. I will leave you to your business." She moved to close her book, to rise from the window seat and retreat to her room, but Frederick held up a hand, a gentle gesture that somehow conveyed both request and command, asking her to wait without words, and she found herself obeying, sinking back onto the cushioned seat as he wrote again, his pencil moving quickly across the page. "Please do not leave on my account," he wrote. "And besides, you have not answered my question. May I be of assistance? You cry like someone who has been forbidden to make sound, who silenced you." The directness of the question, the way it cut through all social pretense and demanded honest response, shocked Emmeline into something approaching truth. And before she could stop herself, before she could retreat behind the pleasant lies that usually shielded her from genuine interaction, she found herself writing, "I silenced myself. It was easier than being punished for noise. Ladies of quality do not make unseemly displays of emotion. I learned that lesson very young, and I learned it well." Frederick read her words, and something changed in his expression, a softening around the eyes, a tightness in his jaw that suggested anger on her behalf. And he wrote again, his pencil pressing hard enough into the paper that she could see the indentations on the page beneath. "Sound is not the only way to scream. I learned that when I lost my hearing at the age of 14, a fever that nearly killed me and left me deaf. At first I thought I had lost everything, that silence meant absence, emptiness, death. But I was wrong. Silence can be peaceful, can be chosen, can be a gift rather than a punishment, but the silence you carry is different. It is enforced, violent, a theft of your right to express yourself. Your face is screaming now. Did you know that? Even without sound, you are screaming, and I can hear you perfectly." Emmeline stared at the words, at this stranger who had somehow seen in 5 minutes what her own family had failed to notice in 26 years. That her silence was not serenity, but suppression. Not peace, but pain. Not choice, but coercion. And she felt something crack open inside her chest. Some wall she had built to protect herself from the knowledge of her own suffering. And fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, faster now, more urgent, though still without sound, still without the wailing that wanted to tear itself from her throat. Frederick watched her cry for a long moment, his grey eyes never leaving her face, reading her grief with the same careful attention he had given to her initial distress. And then he did something that shocked her more than anything else in an already shocking encounter. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingertips brushing against the wet trail of her tears. And then he held his hand up between them so she could see his fingers glistening with the evidence of her pain. He wrote again, one-handed now, holding his tear-dampened fingers up like proof of something important. "I may be deaf," he wrote, "but I am not blind. I see what others miss because I have learned to pay attention, to read faces and bodies and all the small signals that hearing people ignore because they are too busy listening to words, which are often lies anyway. Your tears are real. Your pain is real. And someone who taught you to hide it has done you a great cruelty." She wanted to defend her mother, wanted to explain that Lady Catherine had only been trying to prepare her for the realities of society, that learning to control her emotions had been necessary training for a woman who would need to navigate the complex social hierarchies of the aristocracy. But the words would not come, would not form themselves into the usual justifications and excuses, because looking into Frederick's steady grey eyes, she could not quite believe the lies she had been telling herself for so many years, could not quite maintain the fiction that her silence was strength rather than submission. Instead, she wrote, "How do you do that? How do you see what no one else sees? Everyone at my engagement party last night looked directly at me and saw a happy bride. They mistook my tears for joy. But you walk into a room and immediately know that I am dying inside. How is that possible?" Frederick smiled, a small, sad expression that suggested he understood more than she had said. And he wrote, "Because I have learned that the hearing world is mostly deaf to what matters. They listen to the sounds people make with their mouths, but ignore everything else. The tightness around the eyes, the set of the shoulders, the way someone holds their breath when they are trying not to break. I lost my hearing, but I gained something too. Clarity, the ability to see truth beneath performance. And you, Lady Emmeline, are performing magnificently, while dying magnificently, and I find that unbearably sad. The use of her name startled her. She had not told him who she was. But of course he would know. If their families shared a solicitor, then he would have been briefed on the Dashwood household, would have heard about her engagement to Edmund Whitmore, might even have been at the party last night, though she had no memory of seeing him. But then she had been so lost in her own misery that she had barely registered the faces of the hundreds of guests who had toasted her happiness while she stood silent and dying beside her smug betrothed. She wrote, "You were there last night, at the engagement celebration." He nodded and wrote, I do not usually attend such events. I find the hearing world's social gatherings exhausting. So much performance and so little genuine connection, but my solicitor insisted I make an appearance to show I am reintegrating into English society after my years in Italy. I saw you dancing with Lord Whitmore. I saw the way he held you too tightly, the way you smiled while tears leaked from your eyes. I saw an elderly duchess mistake your pain for joy. And I saw you accept congratulations with perfect grace while clearly wishing you were anywhere else. It was the most skillful performance I have ever witnessed, and the most heartbreaking. Emmeline felt exposed in a way she had never experienced before, seen in a way that should have terrified her, but somehow felt like relief, like finally being able to set down a burden she had been carrying alone for so long that she had forgotten it was even there, had mistaken its weight for the natural state of being, had believed that everyone walked through life with this same crushing pressure on their chest, this same inability to breathe freely. She wrote, I am to marry him in 3 weeks. My family's debts require it. I have no choice in the matter, no escape, no alternative. I will spend the rest of my life performing this role, being the perfect wife to a man who sees me as a convenient solution to his financial problems and nothing more. And I will do it silently, without complaint, because that is what I have been raised to do. Frederick read her words, and his expression hardened, anger flashing in his grey eyes, and he wrote with sharp, decisive strokes that tore slightly into the paper. That is not inevitability. That is imprisonment. You speak as though you have no agency, no power, no right to refuse a future that will destroy you. But you do. You always do. It may not feel that way. The bars of your cage may seem very real and very solid, but they are made of nothing more substantial than other people's expectations and your own fear of what will happen if you say no. She wanted to believe him, wanted to think that freedom was possible, that she could simply refuse to marry Edmund, could walk away from the engagement and the debts and the whole crushing weight of her family's expectations. But the reality seemed insurmountable. She had no money, no skills, no way to support herself if her family cast her out, which they surely would if she defied them in such a fundamental way. Where would she go? How would she live? What could a woman like her possibly do in a world that offered no respectable options for ladies of quality who stepped outside the narrow boundaries prescribed for them? She wrote all of this, her handwriting growing more rushed and desperate as the words poured out, all the practical objections to his idealistic suggestion that she simply choose differently, and Frederick read it all patiently, his expression thoughtful, and then he wrote something that changed everything. I understand your concerns. They are real and legitimate. The world is not kind to women who defy convention. But I wonder if you have considered that some prisons are worse than others, that staying might destroy you more thoroughly than leaving ever could. But I am getting ahead of myself. We have only just met, and I am already suggesting you upend your entire life based on a few written notes and my ability to read tears on your face. Forgive my presumption. He paused, studying her face again with that intense attention. And then he wrote, "I have a proposal, if you will permit it. I come to this library every morning at dawn. It is the only time I can be certain of quiet and solitude, which I require for the work I am doing, translating medical texts from Italian into English, a project that keeps me occupied and gives me purpose beyond simply being a duke. I would be honored if you would join me here. We could continue this conversation. Or not, we could simply read in companionable silence, which I find is one of the great underrated pleasures of life. And perhaps over time you might discover that you are not as powerless as you currently believe, that there are people in this world who see your worth and would help you claim it if you ever decided you wanted something different than the future currently mapped out for you." Emmeline looked at the offer written in his bold, clear handwriting, looked at this strange man who had appeared in her sanctuary like an answer to a prayer she had not known she was praying, who saw her pain without her having to explain it, who treated her silence as something worth noticing rather than something convenient to ignore, who spoke to her as though she were a person rather than a problem to be managed or a possession to be acquired. She picked up the pencil, her hand steadier now than it had been at the beginning of this remarkable conversation, and she wrote simply, "I would like that very much." Frederick smiled, a real smile this time that transformed his serious face and made him suddenly, unexpectedly handsome. And he pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket, monogrammed with a ducal crest, and handed it to her without ceremony, gesturing to her tear-stained face with a matter-of-fact kindness that suggested he saw nothing shameful in her tears, nothing that required apology or explanation. She took the handkerchief, soft linen that smelled faintly of lavender, and something else, something clean and masculine and entirely unlike the cloying cologne Edmund wore, and she wiped her face carefully, the fabric absorbing the evidence of her grief. And when she looked up again, Frederick was watching her with an expression she could not quite name, something tender and fierce all at once, something that made her feel seen and valued in a way she had never experienced before. The morning light had grown stronger while they sat writing notes to each other, and dust motes danced in the golden beams that slanted through the tall windows, illuminating the anatomy book still open on her lap, and Frederick glanced down at it with evident interest, tilting his head to read the title, and then he looked at her with surprise and approval. "You study anatomy," he wrote. "That is unusual for a lady. Most would consider it indelicate." She felt heat rising to her cheeks, embarrassment at being discovered in her secret interest. But there was no judgment in his expression, only curiosity, and she found herself writing, "I am fascinated by how the body works, by the mechanical precision of it all. It seems wrong to live inside something and not understand its workings. But yes, my mother would be horrified if she knew. She already despairs of my unladylike interests, says I think too much and read too much and ask too many questions, that I should focus on watercolors and pianoforte and all the ornamental accomplishments that make a woman marriageable." Frederick's response was immediate and emphatic. "Your mother is wrong. A mind is not something to be decorative. It is something to be developed and challenged and used. In Italy I met many educated women, doctors and scholars and artists. The world is changing even if English society pretends otherwise. Your fascination with anatomy is not a flaw to be corrected, but a strength to be celebrated. Never apologize for being intelligent. It is the only quality that matters in the end." Emmeline felt something bloom in her chest, warm and unfamiliar, something that might have been hope or might have been recognition, the sense that she was not alone in her isolation, that there existed in the world at least one person who did not think her interests were strange or inappropriate, who valued her mind as much as her ability to pour tea and make pleasant conversation, and for the first time since witnessing Edmund's betrayal in the garden, she felt something other than despair, felt the first tentative stirring of possibility, the idea that perhaps there were other ways to live, other futures to inhabit, other versions of herself that did not require silence and submission, and the slow death of everything that made her who she was. The library became their world, a sanctuary that existed outside the normal rules and expectations of society, where for 2 precious hours each dawn Emmeline could shed the performance of being the perfect bride and simply exist as herself, whoever that might be beneath the layers of conditioning and control that had shaped her since childhood. Frederick arrived precisely at sunrise each morning, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet, though she had learned to watch for the way the door opened slowly, carefully, as though he were conscious of not startling her, even though he could not hear the creak of hinges that might have warned of his approach. They had settled into a pattern over those 10 days, meeting as though by accident, though both knew it was deliberate, had become something they needed the way lungs needed air, this space where communication happened not through the performance of polite conversation, but through something more honest, more direct, more real than anything Emmeline had experienced in her 26 years of careful social training. Frederick had begun teaching her to sign on the 3rd morning, explaining through written notes that there existed in London a thriving community of deaf people who had developed their own language, a visual tongue as complex and nuanced as any spoken one, capable of expressing everything from simple requests to complex philosophical arguments, poetry to rage to tenderness, all through the movement of hands and the expressions of face and body. He had shown her the sign for hello, hands moving from forehead outward in a gesture that looked like tipping a hat, had guided her fingers into the right shape for thank you. Hand moving from lips outward like blowing a kiss, had patiently corrected her when she formed the signs clumsily, his hands warm and gentle on hers, positioning her fingers with a care that made her acutely aware of every point of contact between his skin and hers. The process of learning required touch in a way that nothing in her previous life had prepared her for. Frederick would place his hands over hers to demonstrate the proper movement, or cup her chin to angle her face so she could see his lips forming words she was learning to read, or rest his palm against her throat to feel the vibrations when she attempted to make sounds. Small noises that escaped her despite years of training in silence, gasps of surprise when she finally understood a sign, sighs of frustration when her fingers would not cooperate, tiny laughs that felt foreign in her throat, as though they belonged to someone else, some other woman who had not forgotten how to express joy. She had been reluctant at first to make any sound at all, the prohibition against noise so deeply embedded that even here, in privacy, with someone who could not hear her, she found herself swallowing her responses, keeping everything locked inside. But Frederick had written one morning, "I want to feel your laughter. I know you have been taught to be silent, but I think perhaps you have forgotten that sound is not just noise. It is expression. It is freedom. It is proof that you exist as something more than a decoration in someone else's life. Will you try, for me, to make a sound? Any sound? I promise I will not judge it or tell you to be quiet. I only want to know what your joy feels like." The request had terrified her. The idea of deliberately making noise when every instinct screamed at her to remain silent, to take up no space, to cause no disturbance. But something in Frederick's steady grey eyes, something in the way he waited patiently without pressure or expectation, made her want to try, want to give him this gift of sound that he could not hear but could feel. And so she had allowed herself a small laugh, barely more than an exhalation, when he showed her a particularly absurd sign combination that meant something entirely different from what she had expected, and his face had lit with such genuine delight when he felt the vibration under his palm that she had felt something crack open inside her chest, some tight, frozen thing beginning to thaw. Over the 10 days, she found herself making sounds more freely, still quiet, still controlled, but present in a way they had not been before. And each time Frederick would smile as though she had given him something precious, would sometimes close his eyes as his hand rested against her throat, his expression one of deep concentration and pleasure, as though he were memorizing the feeling of her voice even though he could not hear it, and the intimacy of those moments. His skin on hers, his attention so focused and complete, made her feel seen in a way that was both terrifying and addictive. She had brought her botanical drawings to the library on the 5th morning, hesitant to share something so personal, so revealing of her inner life. But Frederick had asked to see them after noticing the charcoal smudges on her fingers, and when she had finally, reluctantly, shown him the portfolio of orchid illustrations she had been working on for years, documenting her mother's prize collection with scientific precision and artistic beauty, he had studied each page with the same careful attention he gave to everything, reading not just the images, but the passion and skill evident in every line, every delicate shading, every perfectly rendered petal and stamen. His response had been immediate and enthusiastic, written in quick, excited strokes across his notebook. "These are extraordinary. You have the eye of a scientist and the hand of an artist. Have you considered publishing them? There are botanical journals that would pay handsomely for illustrations of this quality. In Italy, I met several women who supported themselves through their art. It is not common, but it is possible. You have real talent here, something valuable that belongs to you alone, not to your family or your future husband, but to you." The idea had never occurred to her, that her drawings might be worth something beyond personal satisfaction, that they might represent a skill that could translate into independence, into money, into options that did not currently exist in her carefully circumscribed life. And she had felt a flutter of something dangerous in her chest, something that might have been hope, or might have been the first stirring of rebellion against the future that had been mapped out for her without her consent. They sat closer now than they had in those first days, no longer across the table from each other, but side by side on the window seat, where morning light illuminated the pages between them, her botanical drawings on one side, his Italian medical texts on the other, their shoulders touching as they worked in companionable silence that felt more intimate than conversation, more honest than any of the endless social chatter that filled her days and nights in the world outside this room. Frederick had explained through writing that he was translating texts about the anatomy of hearing, about new theories regarding how sound waves were processed by the brain, about experimental treatments for various types of deafness, and there was no bitterness in his discussion of his condition, no sense that he considered himself broken or diminished, only a fierce intellectual curiosity about how the mechanism of hearing worked and why his own had failed. And Emmeline found herself fascinated not just by the content of his work, but by his attitude toward his deafness, the way he spoke of it as a difference rather than a deficit, a unique way of experiencing the world rather than a lack. In Italy, at the Deaf Institute, he had written one morning when she asked about his years abroad, "I learned that the hearing world is obsessed with sound but deaf to meaning. People listen to the words that come out of mouths, but they miss everything else. The way someone's hands tremble when they are lying, the way eyes slide away when someone is ashamed, the way breath catches when someone is moved. You have been living in silence while surrounded by noise. Emmeline, drowning in meaningless sound while the things that matter, your pain, your intelligence, your passion for beauty and knowledge, go completely unheard by everyone around you." The observation had struck her with the force of revelation, the understanding that her silence was not the problem, that the real issue was that no one had bothered to listen to anything beyond the surface performance, that she had been screaming for years, and no one had noticed because she had learned to scream without making sound, had learned to suffer beautifully and quietly, and therefore invisibly. And Frederick was the first person who had looked closely enough to see the screaming, who had paid attention to what mattered rather than what was convenient to notice. On the 8th morning, with her wedding now just 2 weeks away, Emmeline had arrived at the library with red eyes from another sleepless night spent contemplating her approaching marriage, another evening enduring Edmund's company at a dinner party where he had spent the meal, flirting with other women while she sat silent and smiling, performing the role of content bride while dying inside. And when Frederick had taken one look at her face and immediately pulled out his notebook to write, "What has happened?" She had felt the familiar tears gathering, but had tried to blink them back, to maintain her composure even here, even with him. He had written again, more insistently, "Please do not hide from me. I can see that you are in pain. Talk to me, or write to me, or sign to me if you prefer. But do not perform for me the way you perform for everyone else. I want the real Emmeline, not the one who has been trained to swallow her feelings." She had taken the pencil with shaking hands and written, "I am to be married in 2 weeks. I should not be here. I should not be spending my mornings with you, learning to sign, learning to make sounds, learning to imagine that there might be other ways to live. It only makes everything harder, makes the cage I am walking into more obvious, more unbearable. Perhaps it would be better if we stopped these meetings, if I simply accepted my fate without this taste of what freedom might feel like." Frederick had read her words, and something fierce had flashed in his grey eyes, and he had written back with sharp, decisive strokes. "Is that what you want? To stop meeting? To go back to suffering alone? To marry a man who sees you as property and spend the rest of your life performing contentment while screaming silently inside? Is that truly what you want? Or is it what you have been taught to want? What you believe you deserve? What seems safer than imagining you might choose differently?" She had stared at the question, at the challenge implicit in it, and then he had written again, just 3 words that cut through all her defenses, all her careful rationalizations, all her resigned acceptance of her fate. "Are you happy?" No one had ever asked her that. Not once in her entire life had anyone inquired whether she was happy, whether her feelings mattered, whether the future being arranged for her was one she actually wanted, and the question unlocked something inside her, something she had been holding back even in these morning meetings, even with Frederick, who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect and genuine interest in who she was beneath the performance, and she felt tears spilling down her cheeks, felt her throat tightening, felt words rising up that she had never spoken aloud, had barely admitted even to herself. "No," she had whispered, the word escaping as sound rather than remaining trapped in silence, the single syllable barely audible even to her own ears, but present, real, spoken into existence. And Frederick's hand had immediately come up to rest against her throat, feeling the vibration of her voice, and his expression had transformed, had filled with such joy and triumph and tenderness that she had felt something fundamental shift inside her, some wall crumbling, some door opening that she had not known existed. He had written, "That is the first step, admitting the truth, saying no, making sound even when you have been taught that your voice does not matter. You said no, and I felt it, and it was beautiful. You are beautiful when you are honest, when you let yourself feel and express instead of swallowing everything. And I want you to know that there are alternatives, that you do not have to marry a man who makes you miserable, that you have value beyond your ability to solve your family's financial problems, that you deserve to be happy, truly happy, not performing happiness but feeling it." She had wanted to believe him, wanted to think that alternatives existed, but the practical realities seemed insurmountable, and she had written as much. her handwriting shaky with emotion. "I have no money, no way to support myself, nowhere to go. My family will disown me if I refuse this marriage, and even if they did not, society would never accept a woman who broke an engagement so close to the wedding date. I would be ruined, unmarriageable. I would spend the rest of my life as a cautionary tale, the woman who threw away her one chance at respectability." Frederick had read her objections, and then had written something that made her heart race with a dangerous combination of hope and terror. What if you were not alone? What if someone offered you an alternative, a way to escape this marriage without facing ruin? Would you take it? Or have you been so thoroughly convinced of your powerlessness that you would choose the cage even if the door were opened? She had not known how to answer, had sat in silence, his hand still resting against her throat, feeling her rapid pulse, her shallow breathing, all the physical manifestations of the war being waged inside her between the training of a lifetime and the growing understanding that she did not have to accept the future being forced upon her, that she could choose differently, that Frederick was offering her something, though what exactly she was not yet certain, only that it involved freedom and risk in equal measure. On the 10th morning, just 12 days before her scheduled wedding, Frederick had arrived at the library with a large leather case that he set carefully on the table between them, and when Emmeline had looked at him questioningly, he had written, "I want to show you something. A world you do not know exists. A community of people who will help you understand that silence can be a choice rather than a punishment. Will you come with me this afternoon? I promise you will be perfectly safe, perfectly chaperoned, and perfectly amazed by what you see." She had hesitated, knowing that leaving the house without her mother's knowledge, without a proper chaperone, without a reasonable excuse, was dangerous, was the sort of behavior that could damage her reputation if discovered. But she had also known, with a certainty that surprised her, that she would say yes, that she would go with Frederick wherever he asked, because these morning meetings had awakened something in her, some part of herself that had been sleeping or suppressed for so long that she had forgotten it existed, and that newly awakened self wanted more than the library, wanted to see this world he described, wanted to understand what it meant to choose silence rather than have it enforced. "Yes," she had written, "I will come with you. Tell me when and where, and I will find a way." Frederick's smile had been brilliant, transformative, and he had reached out to take her hand, squeezing it gently before releasing it, a gesture of gratitude and excitement, and something else, something warmer that made her actly conscious of the space between their bodies, of the way his eyes seemed to see straight through to her core, of the fact that she had been married to Edmund in her mind for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to be looked at with genuine appreciation, with desire that had nothing to do with her dowry or her family connections or her suitability as a decorative addition to someone's household. That afternoon, as promised, she had slipped out of the Dashwood townhouse, claiming a headache and a need for fresh air, had met Frederick at the corner where his carriage waited, plain and unmarked rather than bearing his ducal crest, and had allowed him to hand her inside, his touch lingering on her gloved fingers longer than strictly necessary, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. As the carriage rolled through London streets toward whatever destination he had planned, Emmeline had found herself acutely aware of Frederick beside her, of the way their thighs touched on the narrow carriage seat, of the warmth of his body, of the way he watched her face rather than looking out the window, reading her excitement and nervousness, and growing anticipation as though she were one of the medical texts he studied, something fascinating and worth careful attention. She had signed to him, using the vocabulary he had taught her over the past days. "Where are we going?" And he had signed back, "To meet my family, not the one I was born into, but the one I chose, the People who taught me that being deaf was not a tragedy, but simply a different way of experiencing the world. And I think they will help you understand that the cage you live in is not inevitable, that there are other ways to be a woman in this world, other futures available to you if you are brave enough to claim them. The carriage had stopped before a large stone building in a part of London Emmeline did not recognize, and Frederick had helped her descend, had tucked her hand into the crook of his arm with a naturalness that suggested they had been walking together for years rather than days, and had led her through a heavy wooden door into a world she had never imagined existed. And as they crossed that threshold, Emmeline felt something fundamental shift inside her, felt the first real stirrings of the woman she might become if she could find the courage to step fully out of the silence that had been imposed upon her and into the chosen silence, the peaceful silence, the silence that was power rather than punishment. And Frederick's hand warm on hers felt like an anchor, like a promise, like the beginning of something that might save her life if she let it. The London Asylum for the Deaf and Dumb occupied a large Georgian building in Bermondsey, far from the fashionable squares of Mayfair where Emmeline had spent her entire life. And as the hired carriage rattled through increasingly unfamiliar streets, she felt equal parts anticipation and terror at what she was about to do, lying to her mother about a charitable visit to distribute alms to the deserving poor, when in truth she was travelling alone to meet Frederick at a place she had never been, to see a world she had only begun to understand through their dawn meetings in the library over the past 2 weeks. Lady Catherine had been suspicious of Emmeline's sudden interest in charity work, had questioned her closely about which organization she planned to visit, and who would be chaperoning such an expedition, but Emmeline had deployed her lifetime of training in pleasant deception, had smiled serenely and explained that Lady Beatrice Morland, a respectable widow known for her educational work among the unfortunate, would be present to ensure all proprieties were observed, which was technically true, even if the context was entirely different from what her mother imagined. The building itself looked institutional from the outside, all grey stone and barred windows that might have belonged to a prison or workhouse, but the moment Emmeline stepped through the heavy front door, she entered a world so different from anything she had ever experienced that she stood frozen in the entrance hall, overwhelmed by the sheer vitality of the scene before her. The large common room was filled with people, dozens of them, children and adults, all of them deaf, and all of them communicating with an expressiveness and exuberance that took her breath away, hands flying through the air in graceful arcs and sharp gestures, faces animated with emotions that hearing people spent lifetimes learning to suppress, joy and anger and sorrow and laughter all displayed with their whole bodies. Nothing hidden, nothing diminished, nothing forced into the narrow, acceptable range that polite society demanded. Frederick stood near the center of the room, surrounded by a group of children who were clearly telling him some story that required elaborate hand movements and exaggerated facial expressions, and he was laughing, actually laughing out loud without self-consciousness, a sound that hearing people might have found strange, or too loud, but that no one in this room could hear or cared about. And Emmeline realized with a start that this was the first time she had heard him make any vocal sound at all, had assumed perhaps that deaf people did not use their voices, but here were children shrieking with laughter and adults exclaiming and making sounds that accompanied their signs, uninhibited by any concern about volume or propriety. She must have made some noise herself, some small gasp of wonder or surprise, because several people turned to look at her, their faces openly curious rather than politely indifferent, and one small girl of perhaps 6 years old broke away from a group playing some elaborate game and ran directly up to Emmeline, studying her face with the same intense attention Frederick always showed, reading something in her expression that made the child's own face crumple with concern. The girl signed something, her small hands moving in a pattern Emmeline had learned enough over the past 2 weeks to partially understand, asking why she was sad. And before Emmeline could formulate a response, before she could deploy the usual pleasant lies about being perfectly well, tear-sounds began streaming down her face, not silent this time, but accompanied by a sob that escaped her throat before she could stop it, a sound that would have horrified her mother and required immediate suppression in any normal social setting. But here, in this bright room full of people who could not hear it, the sound felt safe, felt permitted, felt like something she was finally allowed to release. The little girl reached up and touched Emmeline's cheek, feeling the tears there, then turned and signed something to the room at large, and several adults approached, including a woman of perhaps 40, with kind eyes and greying hair pulled back in a simple style, who studied Emmeline's face for a long moment before beginning to sign, her hands moving slowly and clearly in a way that suggested she was adjusting her communication for someone still learning this language. Frederick had moved to Emmeline's side by then, and he translated in his notebook. Though Emmeline was beginning to understand more and more without such assistance, Mrs. Beatrice Morland says welcome to our community. She asks if you are the hearing woman who has been learning to sign, the one who cries without sound. Emmeline nodded, wiping at her tears with hands that trembled, and Beatrice signed again, her expression thoughtful and somewhat sad. And Frederick translated, "She says she can see that you have been locked in a cage. She asks me if I plan to free you or merely visit you through the bars." The directness of the question, asked in front of a room full of people who were now openly watching this interaction with interest and concern, should have mortified Emmeline, should have sent her fleeing back to the carriage and the familiar world where people pretended not to notice each other's pain. But instead she found herself signing back, her hands clumsy but earnest, forming the words she had practiced in the library. "I do not know how to be free." Beatrice's face softened, and she signed a long response that Frederick translated. "Freedom is not something anyone can give you. It is something you must choose for yourself. Your Duke brings you here for a reason. He wants you to see that there are other ways to live, other communities that value different things than the hearing world values. Here we do not punish expression, we celebrate it. We encourage our children to use their whole bodies to communicate, to show their feelings without shame, because for us, the body is language, movement is speech, and silence is only oppressive when it is forced upon you, rather than chosen by you." The children had returned to their games, though Emmeline noticed they kept glancing over at her with open curiosity, no pretense of polite disinterest, no social rule requiring them to ignore the crying woman in their midst. And one boy of perhaps 8 approached and signed something that made Frederick smile. "He asks if you would like to play with them." Frederick translated, "They are playing a game where they tell stories with their whole bodies, taking turns adding to the narrative. He says hearing people are often very bad at this game because they are so stiff and controlled, but he thinks you might be good at it if you are willing to try." Emmeline felt a laugh bubble up through her tears. The absurdity of it. A lady of quality being invited to play children's games on the floor of an asylum for the deaf. Her mother would have a fit of apoplexy if she could see this scene, would lecture for hours about dignity and propriety and the absolute unsuitability of such behavior. And perhaps it was that thought that decided her, the image of her mother's horrified face, the delicious rebellion of doing something so thoroughly inappropriate. So she nodded and allowed the boy to pull her toward the group of children who were already launching into an elaborate pantomime that seemed to involve a dragon and a princess and a great deal of running around. For the next hour, Emmeline forgot entirely about being a lady, forgot about propriety and posture and all the rules that had governed her behavior since she was old enough to walk, She ran and laughed and threw herself on the floor. When her character died dramatically in the story, she made exaggerated faces to show fear and joy and surprise. She used her hands to sign the words she knew and pantomimed the ones she did not. And the children laughed with her, not at her, correcting her signs with patient good humor and applauding when she got something right. And for the first time in her life, Emmeline felt what it might be like to express herself fully, to use her whole body as a language, to be seen and accepted exactly as she was, without any requirement to diminish or disguise herself. When the game finally ended and the children were called away for their lessons, Emmeline found herself breathless and disheveled, her carefully arranged hair coming loose from its pins, her dress dusty from the floor, her face flushed and tear-stained, and she felt more alive than she had in 26 years of careful propriety. Beatrice approached again, signing with a smile that reached her eyes, and Frederick translated. "She says you did very well for someone so recently released from her kit. But she also says that 1 hour of freedom does not undo a lifetime of imprisonment, that you must decide whether you want to truly escape, or whether you will return to your cage and pretend this world does not exist." Emmeline signed back slowly. "I am to be married in less than 2 weeks. I do not see how escape is possible." Beatrice's expression grew serious, and she signed a long response that Frederick translated carefully. "Marriage is not inevitability. It is a choice, perhaps a choice with consequences, perhaps a choice that seems impossible given your circumstances, but still a choice. I was married once myself, to a hearing man who saw my deafness as something to be cured or hidden, who wanted me to pretend I could hear, to read lips perfectly and speak clearly, and never sign in public because it embarrassed him. I stayed for 5 years, trying to be what he wanted, trying to force myself into the shape of a hearing woman, and those 5 years nearly destroyed me. When he died, I mourned him as one should mourn a husband, but I also felt relief, and then I felt guilt about that relief, and it took me years to understand that I had been mourning not his death, but the death of myself, the woman I had killed trying to please him." She paused, studying Emmeline's face, then signed again. "I tell you this not to frighten you, but to warn you. Some cages have locks on the inside. You hold the key. You have always held the key. The question is whether you will use it or convince yourself that the cage is protection rather than prison." Frederick had been watching this exchange with an expression Emmeline could not quite read, something intense and careful. And when Beatrice finished signing and moved away to attend to her students, he wrote in his notebook, "She is right. I brought you here not to rescue you, but to show you that rescue is possible, that there are people and communities that will support you if you choose differently, but the choice must be yours. I cannot make it for you. I can only show you that alternatives exist." Emmeline felt the weight of those words, the terrible burden of choice, of agency, of the knowledge that she was not quite as powerless as she had always believed, that her cage had locks on the inside even if she had been trained never to reach for the key. And the knowledge was both liberating and terrifying because it meant that whatever happened next was her responsibility, her decision, her future to claim or surrender. A young woman approached them, perhaps 20 years old, and began signing rapidly to Frederick, her face alive with excitement, and he smiled and signed back, before translating for Emmeline. "This is Clara. She is one of Beatrice's best students. She was born deaf and has never heard sound. She wants to know if it is true that you cry without making noise. She finds this fascinating because, in the deaf community, crying is very visible, very physical. We shake and sob and wail without worrying about who hears us. The idea of silent tears strikes her as incredibly sad." Emmeline felt her eyes filling again, and she signed back as best she could. I was taught that making noise when crying was unseemly, that ladies should suffer quietly without disturbing others. Clara's face filled with such compassion and anger that it startled Emmeline, and the young woman signed back forcefully. Frederick translating, "That is cruel. Emotions are meant to be expressed. Suppressing them does not make them go away. It only makes them poison you from the inside. You should scream. You should wail. You should let everyone know that you are hurting so they can help you. Keeping it silent and hidden only protects the people who hurt you and destroys you." The words hit Emmeline like a physical blow, the simple truth of them, that her silence had never been about strength or dignity, but about protecting her mother and Edmund and everyone else from the inconvenience of her pain, about making their cruelty easier by absorbing it quietly, by dying silently so they could maintain the fiction that everything was fine, that she was content, that the arrangement was working perfectly. Frederick was watching her face again, reading something there, and he signed slowly so she could follow. "Start by making sound. Scream if you need to. We will not hear it, but we will see it, and we will celebrate it. Give yourself permission to be loud, to take up space, to exist fully, rather than diminishing yourself to fit into spaces too small for human souls." Emmeline looked around the bright room, at all these people who had been labelled defective and afflicted and disabled by the hearing world, but who seemed more free, more alive, more fully themselves than anyone she had ever known in Mayfair's drawing rooms, and something inside her cracked open, some final barrier between the woman she had been forced to be and the woman she actually was, and she opened her mouth and screamed. The sound that emerged was raw and primal, years of suppressed rage and grief and terror, pouring out in one long wail that went on until her throat was raw and her chest ached and she had no breath left. And when she finally stopped, gasping and shaking, she looked around expecting horror or disapproval or at minimum discomfort, but instead she saw smiling faces, saw people stamping their feet in the deaf version of applause, saw children laughing not at her but with joy for her, saw Beatrice nodding with approval, saw Frederick watching her with such pride and tenderness that it made her want to cry again, but differently this time, not from pain, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen, of being heard without sound, of being celebrated rather than silenced. The vibration of all those stamping feet travelled through the floorboards, a physical sensation that Emmeline could feel in her bones. This was how deaf people applauded, how they showed approval and joy, through movement and vibration rather than sound. And Emmeline felt that vibration enter her body and shake loose something that had been stuck for so long she had forgotten it was there, some essential part of herself that she had buried to survive her mother's training, her society's expectations, her fiancé's contempt. Beatrice approached and pulled Emmeline into an embrace. No polite air kiss or formal handshake, but a real hug, fierce and warm, and when she pulled back, she signed, "Welcome to the world of the living. You have been dead for a long time, but you are waking up now. Stay awake. Do not let them put you back to sleep." The rest of the visit passed in a blur of new experiences. Emmeline sat in on a lesson where deaf children were learning to read and write in English, their hands moving in complex grammatical discussions that would have put most hearing students to shame. She watched older students practicing their trades, bookbinding and carpentry and tailoring, learning skills that would allow them to support themselves in a world that often refused to employ deaf workers. She met teachers and parents and community members who had built a whole society within London that operated by different rules, valued different things, celebrated what the hearing world called disability as simply difference. As the afternoon sun began to slant through the tall windows, Frederick touched her arm gently to indicate it was time to leave, and Emmeline felt a pang of grief at having to return to the other world, the world of silence and suppression, of propriety and performance, of slow death disguised as duty. She signed her goodbyes to Beatrice and the children, her hands moving more fluently now after hours of practice and immersion, and Beatrice signed back, "Remember, freedom is a choice. You must choose it every day, sometimes many times a day. It is not something you achieve once and keep forever. It is something you practice, something you fight for, something you claim over and over again against all the forces that want to put you back in your cage. Your Duke understands this. Trust him. Trust yourself. Trust that you deserve more than silent suffering." In the carriage on the way back to Mayfair, Emmeline and Frederick sat side by side in the growing twilight, and he wrote in his notebook, "Are you sorry you came? Was it too much?" She took the pencil and wrote back, "I am not sorry. I am grateful, and also terrified, because now I know what freedom looks like, and I understand how thoroughly imprisoned I have been, and I do not know how to go back to my mother's house and pretend that I have not seen another way to live. I do not know how to marry Edmund in less than 2 weeks, knowing that I am choosing a cage when I could choose something different. I do not know how to unknow what I now know." Frederick read her words and wrote, "You do not have to unknow it. You do not have to pretend. You do not have to marry him. I know it seems impossible. I know there are debts and expectations and 100 practical reasons why refusal feels out of reach. But I am telling you, as someone who has lived through the death of one life and the birth of another, as someone who thought losing his hearing was the end of everything, and discovered it was actually the beginning of truth, that you have more power than you believe, more options than you can currently see, more people willing to help than you imagine." She wanted to believe him, wanted to think that she could simply refuse to marry Edmund, could walk away from the engagement and survive the consequences. But the practical realities seemed insurmountable, even more so now that she had glimpsed freedom and understood what she would be losing if she surrendered to the marriage her mother had arranged. The loss seemed bigger now, more devastating, because she knew exactly what she was giving up, not just some vague, abstract idea of happiness, but this specific, vivid experience of being fully alive, fully herself, fully expressed without apology or diminishment. The carriage rolled through the streets of London, leaving Bermondsey behind and returning to Mayfair, to gaslit squares and fashionable townhouses, to the world of whispered cruelties and polite fictions. And with each turn of the wheels, Emmeline felt the weight of her old life settling back onto her shoulders like a familiar coat, heavy and confining, but known, predictable, safe in its very imprisonment. And she understood what Beatrice had meant about choosing freedom every day, about how it was not a single dramatic decision, but 1,000 small choices to stay awake, to remain free, to refuse the comfortable numbness of the cage, even when the cage seemed easier than the terrifying openness of liberation. The library door had been open perhaps 3 inches, enough for the upstairs maid to see through as she passed on her way to turn down the beds for the evening, enough to witness Lady Emmeline Dashwood sitting shoulder to shoulder with the Duke of Wentworth in the window alcove, their hands moving in strange gestures, their faces closer together than propriety strictly allowed, his fingers resting against her throat in a gesture that looked disturbingly intimate, even if the maid could not understand its purpose. And though the girl was not naturally inclined to tale-bearing, the housekeeper had made it clear that any unusual behavior from Miss Emmeline in these final days before her wedding should be reported immediately to Lady Catherine, who was determined that nothing should threaten this advantageous match that would save the family from complete financial ruin. Lady Catherine received the report with an expression that cycled rapidly through surprise, calculation, and something that might have been satisfaction. Her thin fingers drumming on the arm of her chair as she considered the implications of her daughter spending dawn hours in private meetings with a duke, even a damaged one, even one whose deafness made him unsuitable as a husband for a woman of Emmeline's station, given that he could provide no real social advancement and came with the embarrassment of his disability. Still, a duke's attention was notable, was something that could be mentioned in conversation, was proof that Emmeline possessed some quality worth noticing, even if she was plain and too serious, and entirely too interested in inappropriate subjects. For 3 days, Lady Catherine said nothing, merely watched as Emmeline continued to rise before dawn and disappear into the library. As she returned to breakfast with a lightness in her step that had not been there before, as she smiled at nothing in particular, and seemed to exist in some private world that excluded her mother entirely. And Lady Catherine felt the stirrings of unease, the sense that something was shifting in her carefully controlled household, that her daughter was slipping away from her grasp in ways that threatened the marriage arrangement that was the only thing standing between the Dashwood family and complete social and financial collapse. On the 4th day, Lady Catherine positioned herself outside the library door at dawn, waiting in the shadows of the hallway, and when Frederick Wentworth arrived precisely at sunrise and entered without knocking, she gave him 5 minutes before following, opening the door silently to observe the scene within. Her daughter and this duke sitting so close their thighs touched, writing notes to each other and laughing without sound, his hand covering hers on the table in a gesture of casual intimacy that no unmarried couple should share. And Lady Catherine felt cold rage spreading through her chest because she recognized that expression on her daughter's face, had seen it once before in a mirror many years ago when she herself had been young and foolish enough to believe in love, before she learned that such feelings were luxuries that women in precarious financial positions could not afford. She entered the library with the deliberate tread of judgment itself, and Emmeline looked up with an expression that moved from joy to terror in the space of a heartbeat, her hand jerking away from Frederick's as though burned, her body instinctively curling inward in a posture of defense that spoke of long experience with her mother's anger. And Frederick rose slowly to his feet, his grey eyes moving between mother and daughter, reading the situation with that uncanny perception that allowed him to see what hearing people missed, understanding immediately that he had caused trouble for Emmeline simply by existing in her world. Lady Catherine did not acknowledge Frederick beyond a curt nod, her attention fixed entirely on her daughter, her voice low and venomous in a way that made Emmeline flinch. "Your wedding is in 1 week, and I find you entertaining a gentleman in private without chaperone or propriety. Explain yourself immediately." Emmeline opened her mouth, but no sound emerged, the words dying in her throat as they always did when confronted with her mother's fury, and she felt the familiar paralysis settling over her, the trained response of silence and submission. But then she felt Frederick's hand on her shoulder, a gentle pressure that somehow gave her courage, and she managed to whisper, "We were only reading, Mother, discussing books." Nothing improper occurred. Lady Catherine's laugh was sharp and cruel. "Reading," she repeated, her tone making it sound like an accusation. "You expect me to believe that you rise before dawn to read with a duke who cannot even hear you? Do not insult my intelligence, Emmeline. I may not know what happens in this room, but I know the look on your face. I know what affection looks like, and I will not allow you to jeopardize this marriage with some foolish romantic notion about a damaged man who can offer you nothing but social embarrassment and financial uncertainty." Frederick had been reading Lady Catherine's lips, and he wrote quickly in his notebook before holding it up for her to see, "I have offered Lady Emmeline nothing but friendship and intellectual conversation. If you find that threatening, Perhaps you should examine what kind of marriage you are forcing her into, that it cannot survive her having a friend. Lady Catherine snatched the notebook from his hands, read it, and threw it back at him with a fury that made Emmeline gasp. "How dare you speak to me of what I am forcing? You know nothing of our circumstances, nothing of the debts that hang over this family like a sword, nothing of the sacrifices required to maintain our position in society. My daughter will marry Viscount Whitmore in 1 week as planned, and you will cease these inappropriate meetings immediately, or I will ensure that every drawing-room in London knows that the deaf Duke of Wentworth has been pursuing an engaged woman, destroying both her reputation and yours." Frederick held Lady Catherine's gaze steadily, unflinching, and wrote again. "You cannot destroy what I do not value. I care nothing for society's opinion, but Emmeline does, or has been taught to, so I will honor her wishes. If she asks me to leave, I will leave. If she asks me to stay, I will stay. The choice is hers, not yours." The suggestion that Emmeline had any choice in the matter seemed to enrage Lady Catherine beyond measure, and she grabbed her daughter's arm with bruising force, dragging her toward the door while Emmeline stumbled and tried to pull away, tried to look back at Frederick, tried to say something, anything, but her voice had abandoned her again, had retreated into the learned silence of 26 years, and she allowed herself to be pulled from the library like a child, like property, like something with no will of its own. Lady Catherine marched Emmeline directly to her bedroom and shoved her inside with enough force that she stumbled and nearly fell, and then her mother followed her in, closing the door behind them with a finality that made Emmeline's heart sink. "You will remain in this room until your wedding day," Lady Catherine announced, her voice ice-cold. "I will have meals brought to you. I will allow your maid to attend you, but you will see no one else, speak to no one else, and certainly you will not continue these disgraceful meetings with the Duke. I had thought, perhaps, his attention might be useful, might add some prestige to your marriage, but I see now that you have developed feelings for him, feelings that could threaten everything I have worked to secure, and I will not allow it." Emmeline found her voice, finally, small and desperate. "Mother, please, I have done nothing wrong. We only talked, only read together. I swear nothing improper occurred." Lady Catherine's expression was pitiless. "The impropriety is in your heart, Emmeline. I can see it in your face. You look at him the way I once looked at someone, and I learned at great cost that such feelings are worthless when set against practical necessity. Your father left us with debts that will destroy us if this marriage does not proceed. Do you understand? We will lose this house, our position, everything. We will be cast out into genteel poverty, unable to show our faces in society, and all because you developed a childish infatuation with a man who cannot even hear you." The words struck Emmeline like physical blows, and she felt tears beginning to stream down her face, silent as always, but her mother saw them and showed no sympathy. "Tears will not change the reality of our situation," she said coldly. "You will marry Edmund Whitmore, you will be a dutiful wife, and you will forget this foolish notion that you deserve anything more than security and respectability. Love is a luxury we cannot afford, and the sooner you accept that, the easier your life will be." For the next 3 days, Emmeline remained locked in her room, her meals brought by her maid Clara, a young woman of perhaps 20, who had always shown her kindness, who now looked at her with such pity that it made Emmeline want to scream, but she remained silent, sat by her window looking out at the square below, watching the world continue as though nothing had changed, as though she had not just lost the one person who had ever truly seen her, who had taught her that silence could be chosen rather than enforced, who had shown her a world where expression was celebrated rather than punished. On the 4th day of her imprisonment, Lady Catherine brought Edmund to visit, announcing his presence with a sharp knock before opening the door and ushering him in, and Emmeline felt her stomach turn at the sight of him, at his smug expression, and the way his eyes travelled over her body in a manner that felt violating even though he had not touched her. "Your mother has explained that you have been unwell," Edmund said, his tone suggesting he did not believe this explanation for a moment. "She thinks it would be helpful for us to discuss the more practical aspects of our upcoming union, to ensure that you understand what will be expected of you as my wife, particularly in the marital chamber." Emmeline felt her face burning with shame and anger, understanding immediately that this conversation was designed to humiliate her, to remind her of her powerlessness, to break whatever spirit she had managed to reclaim during her meetings with Frederick, and she opened her mouth to protest, but Lady Catherine silenced her with a sharp gesture. "You will listen to your future husband, Emmeline. It is time you understood the realities of marriage. The romantic notions you may have entertained must be set aside in favour of practical understanding of your duties." What followed was the most degrading 15 minutes of Emmeline's life, Edmund describing in crude detail what he expected from her on their wedding night, and thereafter speaking of her body as though it were property he had purchased, discussing his rights and her obligations with a casual cruelty that made her feel sick. While her mother stood by, nodding approval, occasionally interjecting comments about the importance of wifely submission and the natural order of marriage. And through it all, Emmeline sat frozen, silent, tears streaming down her face, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to do anything but endure. When Edmund finally finished his lecture, he approached her chair and pulled her roughly to her feet, his hands gripping her shoulders hard enough to bruise. "You understand now what marriage means," he said, his face inches from hers, his breath hot and sour. "You belong to me, Emmeline. Your body, your time, your very thoughts belong to me, and you will learn to obey. Silent or not, you will obey." He leaned in to kiss her, and something inside Emmeline finally broke free, some last reserve of self-preservation that had been building since the conservatory, since the engagement. Partly since she had learned what it felt like to be truly seen and valued by someone like Frederick, and she shoved him away with all her strength, the movement so sudden and unexpected that he stumbled backward, and she heard herself shouting, the word tearing from her throat like something physical being expelled. "No!" Edmund's face darkened with rage, and before Emmeline could register what was happening, his hand flew out and connected with her cheek with a crack that echoed in the room, the force of the blow sending her reeling sideways, her hand flying to her face where she could already feel heat blooming, the sting of impact spreading across her skin, and she tasted blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her mouth. Lady Catherine, hearing the commotion, rushed into the room and took in the scene with one sharp glance, her daughter holding her bleeding mouth, Edmund standing over her with fist still raised, and rather than defending Emmeline or expressing shock at the violence, she turned on her daughter with fury. "Hysterics," she pronounced, as though Emmeline's refusal to be kissed and her subsequent assault were merely symptoms of feminine weakness. "This is exactly the sort of unseemly display I was afraid of. You will not embarrass this family or jeopardize this marriage with your theatrical outbursts." She moved to a cabinet and withdrew a small brown bottle, the laudanum she kept for headaches and nerves, and despite Emmeline's attempts to pull away, to refuse the medicine, Lady Catherine forced several drops between her lips, holding her jaw shut until she swallowed, and within minutes Emmeline felt the drug begin to work, felt her limbs growing heavy, her thoughts turning thick and slow, felt herself sinking into a grey haze where everything seemed distant and unimportant, even the pain in her face, even the terror of what had just happened, even the knowledge that in less than a week she would be married to a man who had just struck her and would have every legal right to do so again, and worse once she became his wife. She was vaguely aware of Edmund leaving, of her mother speaking in low tones about managing her daughter's nerves, of being guided to her bed, where she lay staring at the canopy above her while the room spun gently, and in her drugged state she thought of Frederick, of the way his hands had felt on hers, of the vibration of her laughter against his palm, of the deaf children stamping their feet in approval when she screamed, of Beatrice signing that freedom was a choice that must be made every day. And she understood with terrible clarity that she was choosing the cage, was surrendering to the marriage despite everything she had learned, despite everything Frederick had shown her, because she was too frightened, too conditioned, too convinced of her own powerlessness to fight for anything different. Over the next 2 days, Emmeline remained in a laudanum haze, her mother dosing her regularly to keep her compliant and quiet, and during the brief periods when the drug wore off enough for her to think clearly, she was consumed with self-loathing and despair, understanding that she was betraying herself, betraying Frederick, betraying everything she had glimpsed in that bright room in Bermondsey, where deaf children laughed without shame, and people expressed themselves fully without fear of punishment. On the 2nd day of her drugged imprisonment, Clara brought her dinner tray, and after checking that the hallway was clear, slipped Emmeline a pen and paper. "His Grace has been asking after you," the maid whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. "He comes every day to the house, but your mother refuses to see him. He leaves notes, but she burns them. He looks desperate, miss, like a man who has lost something precious. If you wanted to write to him, I could get the letter out. My brother works in the Duke's household. He could deliver it without anyone knowing." Emmeline took the paper with shaking hands, and through the fog of laudanum and despair, she wrote what felt like the only honest thing she could say, the only truth that mattered in this moment, when she understood with perfect clarity that she lacked the courage to save herself. "I am a coward. I cannot be free. Forgive me. Forget me. You showed me another world, but I am too weak to reach for it. I will marry Edmund in 5 days, and I will die slowly in that marriage, and it is my own fault for being unable to choose differently. I am sorry. I am so sorry. I wish I were braver. I wish I were stronger. I wish I were the woman you seemed to think I could be. But I am not. I am exactly what my mother made me, a silent, obedient thing with no will of its own. Please forget you ever knew me. Please do not waste another thought on someone so thoroughly broken. I release you from any obligation you might feel. I free you even as I cannot free myself." She folded the letter and gave it to Clara, who tucked it into her apron and slipped from the room. And Emmeline lay back on her bed, staring at the wedding dress that hung in the corner like a ghost, like a shroud, like the physical manifestation of her future, white and pristine and utterly suffocating, and she let the tears flow silently as they always had, as they always would, because she was returning to the silence she had been briefly freed from, was accepting the cage, even though she now knew exactly what she was surrendering. And the knowledge made it so much worse than the original blind acceptance, made it feel like suicide rather than duty, like choosing death over life, like the ultimate betrayal of everything Frederick had tried to show her about who she could be if she were brave enough to claim it. The laudanum pulled her under again, and she dreamed of stamping feet and flying hands and a room full of people who celebrated expression rather than punishing it. And in her dream, she was screaming, loud and long and free. But when she woke, her throat was raw, and her mother was standing over her with another dose of medicine, and Emmeline understood that even her dreams of freedom would be taken from her, that she would spend the rest of her life in this grey haze of compliance and silence. And she had chosen it herself, had surrendered without a fight, had proven her mother right that she was weak and biddable and entirely unsuited for anything more than silent suffering in service of family duty. And the shame of that recognition was worse than any physical pain, worse than Edmund's slap or her mother's cruelty, because it was the wound she had inflicted on herself, the choice she had made to return to the cage even when the door had been opened, even when Frederick had stood waiting to help her escape, if only she had been brave enough to walk through. The drawing-room of the Dashwood townhouse had never held such a gathering, such an unlikely assembly of power and purpose that seemed to bend the very air with tension, and Lady Catherine stood near the fireplace with her hand pressed to her throat, her face pale with shock and calculation as she took in the three people who had invaded her domain, despite her explicit instructions to the butler that she was not receiving visitors. Frederick Wentworth, Duke of Wentworth, stood in the center of the room with the presence of a man who had learned that physical stature mattered far less than the force of will behind it, his grey eyes blazing with an anger that needed no sound to be perfectly understood, his hands moving in sharp, decisive gestures that spoke volumes to those who could read them, and beside him stood two allies who made refusal of his demands all but impossible. The Duke of Brandon was perhaps 50, with silver threading through his dark hair and the kind of aristocratic bearing that came from generations of unquestioned authority, and he watched Lady Catherine with cool assessment, a lawyer's mind calculating every possible outcome, every advantage and liability, every pressure point that might be applied to achieve the desired result. Mrs. Beatrice Morland stood on Frederick's other side, her deaf silence somehow more powerful than any spoken words, her presence itself a challenge to the hearing world's assumptions about weakness and disability, and in her hands she held a leather portfolio that Lady Catherine eyed with growing dread. The Duke of Brandon spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority and social position. Lady Catherine, I am here as both friend to the Duke of Wentworth and as a solicitor with information regarding your daughter's engagement to Viscount Edmund Whitmore, information that I believe will significantly alter your perspective on the advisability of this match. May we sit and discuss this matter like civilized people, or must we conduct this conversation standing like adversaries? Lady Catherine gestured stiffly toward the furniture, her mind racing through possibilities, trying to understand what could have brought a duke and a solicitor to her home, what information they could possibly possess that would concern Emmeline's engagement, but she maintained her composure, lowering herself into a chair with the studied grace of a woman who had spent her life performing dignity even when terrified. Frederick remained standing, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression one of barely contained fury, and Lady Catherine found herself unable to meet his eyes, found something unsettling in the way he watched her, as though he could see through every pretense, every carefully constructed justification for her treatment of Emmeline. The Duke of Brandon opened the leather portfolio and withdrew several documents, laying them on the table between them with deliberate precision. Over the past week, he began, his tone professionally neutral, at the Duke of Wentworth's request, I have conducted a thorough investigation into the financial and personal circumstances of Viscount Edmund Whitmore, and what I have discovered is deeply troubling. Lord Whitmore's debts exceed £30,000, accumulated through gambling and reckless speculation. His creditors include several extremely unsavory characters who would not hesitate to employ violence to secure repayment. Furthermore, he maintains an ongoing liaison with a Miss Lydia Hartwell, whom I understand is Lady Emmeline's cousin, and has promised this young woman that he will continue the relationship after his marriage, treating his future wife as merely a financial convenience rather than a true partner. Lady Catherine's face had grown progressively paler during this recitation, but she rallied, attempting to dismiss the information with a wave of her hand. The financial difficulties of young men are common, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. As for the other matter, I am aware that gentlemen often maintain certain arrangements. It is not ideal, but it is hardly unprecedented. My daughter has been raised to understand the realities of marriage among our class. The Duke of Brandon's expression hardened. You are aware, then, that Lord Whitmore struck your daughter 3 days ago, that he left visible bruising on her face, that he has expressed his intention to, and I quote from a letter intercepted by my investigators, train her to proper obedience through whatever means necessary once they are married and her person becomes his legal property. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, and Lady Catherine felt her carefully constructed defences beginning to crumble. But she was not ready to surrender, not when so much depended on this marriage, not when her family's survival hung in the balance. "My daughter provoked him," she said weakly. "She has been difficult, emotional, refusing to accept her responsibilities. A firm hand may be necessary to guide her toward proper wifely behavior." Frederick's hands moved in a gesture so sharp and angry that even Lady Catherine, who could not understand sign language, flinched at the obvious fury in the movement, and Mrs. Morland translated in a clear, cold voice. "The Duke says you are a monster who has tortured your daughter for 26 years and now seek to deliver her to a man who will continue that torture for the rest of her life. He says you do not deserve to be called a mother, that you have failed in every duty a parent owes a child, that you have sacrificed your daughter's happiness, safety, and very soul to preserve your own social standing, and he will not allow it to continue." Lady Catherine drew herself up, attempting to reassert her authority. "The Duke of Wentworth may think whatever he pleases, but he has no authority over my daughter or my household. Emmeline will marry Lord Whitmore in 3 days as planned. We have debts that must be paid, obligations that must be met. His family's settlement is the only thing standing between us and ruin. Whatever your Grace's personal feelings, that is the reality of our situation." The Duke of Brandon smiled, a cold expression that held no warmth. "That brings us to the second part of our business here today. I have also investigated your family's debts, Lady Catherine, and I have taken the liberty of purchasing them, all of them, from your various creditors, which means that the Dashwood family now owes approximately £15,000, not to a collection of merchants and moneylenders, but to me personally, and I am prepared to forgive that debt entirely, to consider it paid in full on one condition." Lady Catherine stared at him, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, her mind struggling to process this information, to understand what was being offered and what it would cost. "The condition," the Duke of Brandon continued, "is that you immediately release Lady Emmeline from her engagement to Lord Whitmore, that you allow her to make her own choice regarding her future, and that you never again attempt to control her life through financial manipulation or emotional cruelty. If you agree to these terms, your debts disappear, your family retains its home and position, and you lose only the illusion of power over your daughter. If you refuse, I will call in the debts immediately, will pursue legal action for their recovery, and will ensure that every drawing room in London knows that you attempted to force your daughter into marriage with a violent man of questionable character to cover your own financial mismanagement. It was not a choice, but the illusion of one, a trap disguised as an offer, and Lady Catherine understood immediately that she had been outmaneuvered, that Frederick Wentworth had brought forces to bear that she could not hope to resist. But even as she calculated the benefits of surrender, even as she recognized that a duke's protection was worth more than a viscount's settlement, she felt rage at being forced to yield, at losing control over the daughter she had shaped and molded for this exact purpose. "Very well," she said finally, her voice tight with suppressed fury. "I agree to your terms. The engagement to Lord Whitmore is dissolved. You may inform him that I have reconsidered the match, but I fail to see what this achieves beyond leaving my daughter unmarried and without prospects, unless your Grace has some alternative arrangement in mind." Frederick had been watching this exchange with his hand pressed to the table, feeling the vibrations of voices he could not hear, reading lips and body language and all the visual cues that told him the negotiation was proceeding as planned. And now he moved forward, pulling out his own notebook and writing quickly before holding it up for Lady Catherine to read. "I am offering an alternative," he had written in his bold, clear hand. I am asking Lady Emmeline to marry me instead. I will settle all your family's debts, will provide a generous allowance for your household, will ensure that you maintain your position in society, but in exchange, Emmeline becomes my wife, not your possession. She will live as she chooses, express herself as she chooses, and you will have no authority over her ever again. These are my terms. Bring her down so I can ask her myself, so she can choose freely without your interference or manipulation." Lady Catherine stared at the words, her mind spinning through the implications. A duke's offer was infinitely superior to a viscount's. The social elevation alone was worth more than Edmund's settlement had ever been, but she also understood that she was being asked to give up all control, all influence, all the power she had wielded over Emmeline since birth, and the loss felt unbearable even as the gain was undeniable. "She has been unwell," Lady Catherine said carefully, attempting one last manipulation. "She has been taking medicine for her nerves. She may not be in a fit state to make such an important decision." Frederick's expression darkened further, and he wrote again, his pencil pressing so hard into the paper that it tore slightly. "You have been drugging her to keep her compliant. I know this. My investigator spoke with your maid. Bring her down now, or I will go up and get her myself. You no longer have any say in this matter. Your choice is whether to cooperate gracefully or to be exposed as the cruel, controlling woman you are. Decide quickly because my patience is exhausted." Lady Catherine rose stiffly and moved to the bell-pull, summoning a servant and instructing them to bring Miss Emmeline to the drawing-room immediately, to help her dress if necessary, but to bring her down regardless of her state. And then she returned to her chair, her hands folded in her lap, her expression one of barely suppressed rage masked by forced courtesy. The wait seemed eternal, minutes stretching like hours while Frederick paced the room, his movements tight with anxiety, his hands occasionally forming signs that Mrs. Morland responded to with gentle reassurance, and the Duke of Brandon reviewed his documents with the calm of someone confident in the outcome, and Lady Catherine sat rigid and furious, mourning the loss of her power even as she calculated the social advantages of having a duke as a son-in-law. When the door finally opened and Emmeline appeared, supported by her maid Clara, Frederick felt his heart contract painfully at the sight of her. She was still in her nightclothes with a dressing gown thrown over them, her hair loose and tangled, her face pale and slack from the laudanum, her eyes unfocused and confused, and on her cheek, clearly visible even in the afternoon light, was the purple bruise where Edmund had struck her, the mark of violence that made Frederick's hands clench into fists, made him want to find Edmund Whitmore and deliver a much more thorough beating. But he forced himself to remain calm, to focus on Emmeline, to remember that this moment was about her choice, not his anger. Emmeline's eyes found him across the room, and he saw recognition dawn, saw confusion and hope and fear war in her expression, saw her try to speak, but no sound emerge, saw her look to her mother with the automatic response of someone seeking permission, and he moved toward her quickly, crossing the space between them and dropping to his knees before her, so that their eyes were level, so that she could see his face clearly, so that he could communicate directly without the interference of her mother or anyone else. Her hands were shaking as he took them in his own, and he could feel the tremor running through her whole body, could see that she was struggling to focus through the drug haze, and he signed slowly, clearly, forming each word with deliberate precision so she could follow even in her impaired state. "I received your letter," he signed, "and I am here to tell you that you are not a coward, that you are not broken, that you are worthy of freedom and happiness and every good thing this world has to offer. Your mother has agreed to release you from your engagement to Edmund Whitmore. You are free of him, free of that future, but I want to offer you something different, not another cage, but a true choice." He paused, watching her face, seeing the tears beginning to stream down her cheeks, and he continued signing. "Marry me, Emmeline. Marry me, and I will never ask you to be silent. I will never ask you to diminish yourself. I will never ask you to be anything other than exactly who you are. I will protect you and support you and help you discover who you might become without the weight of your mother's expectations crushing you. But this is your choice, not a transaction, not a duty, not a sacrifice. If you do not want to marry me, if you would prefer to be free without attaching yourself to another man, I will still pay your family's debts, will still ensure your freedom, will still offer you any help you need to build whatever life you choose. You do not owe me anything. You do not have to accept my proposal. You only have to choose what you want, and whatever that is, I will support it. Emmeline stared at him, her hands still trembling in his grasp, her mind struggling to process what he was offering, what he was asking, whether this was real or some laudanum-induced hallucination, whether she dared to believe that freedom was actually possible, that she could choose differently, that someone actually valued her enough to offer her a choice rather than simply transferring her from one form of ownership to another. Her hands moved slowly, clumsily, forming signs she had learned in their dawn meetings in the library, in that bright room in Bermondsey, asking the question that had haunted her since she wrote that terrible letter of surrender. Why would you want someone so broken? She signed, someone so thoroughly damaged by years of silence and submission, someone who cannot even speak without permission, someone who has proven herself a coward. Frederick's expression softened, and he signed back with a tenderness that made her chest ache. You are not broken, he signed. You are bound. There is a difference. Broken things cannot be repaired, but bound things can be freed. You have spent your entire life in chains, but the chains are not part of you. They are imposed from outside. And I am asking, will you unbind yourself? Will you choose freedom even though it is terrifying? Will you choose a future that you build rather than one that is built for you? Will you choose me? Not because you have to, not because you owe me, not because you have no other option, but because you want to, because you believe you deserve happiness, because you are brave enough to reach for something better than what you have been told to accept. Emmeline looked into his grey eyes and saw something she had never seen in any man's gaze before. She saw respect, admiration, desire that had nothing to do with her dowry or her family name, or her usefulness as a social ornament. She saw someone who had looked at her genuine self, messy and emotional and intellectual and inappropriate as it was, and decided that she was worth fighting for, worth kneeling before, worth offering a choice when he could have simply struck a bargain with her mother and treated her as property to be transferred. She glanced at her mother, sitting rigid and furious in her chair, and she thought about all the years of training, all the slaps and corrections and endless lessons in silence and submission, all the ways she had been shaped to fit into a mold that was too small for human souls. And she thought about the conservatory where she had watched Edmund kiss Lydia, about the engagement party where she had smiled through tears while he announced their wedding date, about his crude whispers and violent hands and the future that had stretched before her like a prison sentence. Then she thought about the library mornings, about learning to sign, about Frederick's hand on her throat, feeling her laughter, about the bright room in Bermondsey where deaf children played without shame, and she had screamed her first real scream, about Beatrice stamping her feet in approval and signing that freedom was a choice that must be made every day. And she understood that this moment was one of those choices, perhaps the most important one she would ever make, the choice between the familiar cage and the terrifying openness of liberation. Her hands moved slowly at first, then with increasing certainty, forming the signs Frederick had taught her, spelling out words that felt like revolution. Yes, she signed, I choose freedom. I choose you. I choose a future that I build rather than one that is built for me. I am terrified, and I do not know if I am strong enough, but I want to try. I want to be brave enough to reach for something better. I want to unbind myself, even if I do not yet know who I will be without the chains. Will you help me? Will you be patient with me while I learn to be free?" Frederick's face transformed with joy, and he pulled her down to kneel with him on the floor, his arms wrapping around her as she collapsed against his chest, her body shaking with sobs that were no longer silent, sounds pouring from her throat without restraint or apology, loud, messy grief and relief and terror and hope all mixed together. And he held her while she cried, his hand on her back feeling the vibrations of her voice. And he was smiling, actually smiling while she wept, because he understood that this was not breakdown, but breakthrough, not weakness, but the first real expression of strength she had ever allowed herself. Lady Catherine stood abruptly, her face white with rage. "This is unseemly," she began, but the Duke of Brandon cut her off with a gesture. "Sit down, Lady Catherine," he said coldly. "You have no authority here any more. The Duke of Wentworth has made his offer and Lady Emmeline has accepted. The banns will be posted tomorrow. The wedding will take place as soon as legally possible, and you will attend with a pleasant expression and congratulations for your daughter, or you will not attend at all. Those are your only choices. I suggest you choose wisely." Mrs. Morland approached the kneeling couple, and when Emmeline looked up with tear-stained face, Beatrice signed with a smile. "Welcome to the world of the living. You have chosen freedom. Now comes the hard part, learning to live it every day. But you will not be alone. We will help you. The deaf community will embrace you, and your Duke will protect you. You have made the right choice, the brave choice, the choice that will save your life." Emmeline signed back shakily. "I am still afraid. I do not know how to be free. I have spent my whole life learning to be silent and obedient. I do not know who I am without those things." Beatrice signed. "That is the adventure, discovering who you are when you are not performing for someone else, when you are not shrinking yourself to fit into spaces too small. It will take time. There will be days when you want to return to the cage because it is familiar and freedom is exhausting. But freedom is also beautiful, is also worth the difficulty, is also the only thing that makes life worth living. And you have already taken the first step. You have chosen. Everything else follows from that choice." Frederick helped Emmeline to her feet, supporting her as she swayed slightly, still affected by the laudanum and overwhelmed by everything that had just happened. And he signed, "We should go. I want to take you away from this house, away from your mother. I have prepared rooms for you at my residence with Mrs. Morland as chaperone to preserve all propriety. You can rest there, recover from the drugs your mother has been giving you, and when you are ready, we can plan our wedding. Or not. We can simply exist together for a while, learning to communicate, learning to be free. Whatever you need, I will provide." Emmeline nodded, and then, with effort, she turned to face her mother. This woman who had shaped and controlled her entire life, who had taught her that silence was survival and expression was danger, who had drugged her and locked her away and tried to sell her to a violent man to cover family debts. And she opened her mouth and spoke, her voice rough from disuse and medication, but present, real, audible. "I am leaving," she said, the words feeling strange in her throat after so many years of learned silence. "I am marrying the Duke of Wentworth, and I am never coming back to this house. You will have your debts paid, you will keep your position in society, but you will no longer have any control over me. I am done being your possession, your solution, your sacrifice. I am claiming my own life, and you cannot stop me." Lady Catherine's face twisted with fury and something that might have been grief, but she said nothing, merely turned away as though she could dismiss this rebellion by refusing to acknowledge it. And Emmeline felt a strange liberation in that turning away, understood that her mother's opinion, her mother's approval, her mother's love had never been available anyway, had always been conditional on perfect obedience and complete self-suppression, and she was finally choosing to stop trying to earn something that was never going to be given. Frederick guided her toward the door, Mrs. Morland and the Duke of Brandon following, and as they left the drawing-room, as they walked through the entrance hall where she had spent 26 years learning to make herself small and silent and invisible, Emmeline felt something shifting inside her chest, some heavy weight beginning to lift, some locked door beginning to open, and though she was still frightened, still uncertain, still struggling to believe that this was real and not just another laudanum dream that would dissolve when she woke, she also felt for the first time in her life the faint stirring of hope, the possibility that there might be another way to exist in the world, and that possibility alone was worth every risk, every consequence, every terrifying step into the unknown. Emmeline stood in the drawing-room with Frederick still kneeling before her, his grey eyes full of hope and tenderness and patient waiting, with Mrs. Morland and the Duke of Brandon watching with expressions of approval and anticipation, with her mother rigid and furious in her chair, with Clara the maid hovering near the doorway with tears streaming down her face, and she felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her like a physical force, this choice that would determine the entire course of her future, this decision that could not be unmade once spoken, and she realized with sudden clarity that she could not simply accept Frederick's proposal, could not merely transfer herself from one man's protection to another's, could not truly choose freedom until she had first broken the chains herself, had first destroyed the symbols of her captivity, had first claimed her voice in a way that was undeniable and irrevocable. "I need time," she signed to Frederick, her hands still shaking but her movements deliberate. "I need 1 hour alone to think, to write, to understand what I am choosing. Will you wait for me? Will you trust me to return?" Frederick's face showed surprise but no disappointment, and he signed back immediately. "Take all the time you need. I will wait here, or I will wait 1,000 years if necessary. This is your choice, and it must be made in your own time, in your own way. I trust you completely." Emmeline nodded and turned toward the door, ignoring her mother's sharp demand to know where she thought she was going, ignoring the Duke of Brandon's questioning look, walking past Clara, who stepped aside to let her pass, and she moved through the familiar hallways of the house with a strange sense of seeing them for the first time, or perhaps for the last time, understanding that whatever happened in the next hour, she would never be the same person who had walked these halls in silent submission for 26 years. The library door opened under her hand with the familiar creak she had heard 1,000 mornings. But today the sound seemed different, seemed to mark a threshold between her old life and whatever came next. And she entered the room that had been her only sanctuary, the place where she had first met Frederick, where she had first learned that silence could be chosen rather than enforced, where she had first glimpsed the possibility of another way to exist. She went directly to the writing desk and pulled out a fresh journal, the leather binding soft and unmarked, pages blank and waiting, and she picked up her pen with hands that trembled with something between terror and exhilaration, and she began to write. Everything she had never said, everything she had swallowed and suppressed and hidden away in the deepest parts of herself, poured out onto the pages in a flood of words that felt like blood leaving a wound, like poison being purged from a body, like truth that had been locked away for so long that releasing it felt like violence. She wrote about her father's funeral, about being 8 years old and grief-stricken and slapped for crying too loudly, about learning that her pain was less important than other people's comfort, about discovering that silence was survival and sound was danger. She wrote about every insult her mother had delivered in the name of improvement, every correction designed to make her smaller, quieter, more acceptable, more marriageable, more willing to accept whatever scraps of affection and respect men like Edmund chose to offer. She wrote about the conservatory, about watching Edmund kiss Lydia, about the sickening understanding that her husband would see her as nothing more than a financial convenience and a domestic manager, about the engagement party where she had smiled and curtsied while dying inside, about Edmund's crude whispers and violent hands, and her mother's complicity in delivering her to such a man. She wrote about Frederick, about the first time he had touched her tears and seen what no one else had bothered to notice, about learning to sign, about feeling her laughter vibrate against his palm, about the deaf community in Bermondsey where children laughed without shame and expression was celebrated rather than punished, about the scream that had torn from her throat in that bright room, about feeling the vibration of stamping feet as deaf people applauded her release. She wrote about her rage, about the fury that had been building for 26 years beneath the pleasant surface her mother demanded, about how much she hated the woman who had given birth to her, and then spent decades crushing everything vital and alive out of her daughter, about how she wanted to burn this house down, wanted to destroy every symbol of her captivity, wanted to scream until her throat was raw and her voice was hoarse, and everyone in Mayfair could hear the pain that had been hidden for so long. The writing took perhaps 30 minutes, her hand cramping as words poured out faster than she could comfortably transcribe them, and when she finally set down the pen and read back what she had written, she felt simultaneously lighter and more terrified than she had ever been, because these words were the truth, the undeniable truth of her experience. And once acknowledged, they could not be unacknowledged. Once given form, they could not be forced back into formlessness. She closed the journal and stood, and as she did, her eyes fell on the window that overlooked the conservatory. Her mother's pride, the collection of exotic orchids that required such perfect conditions to surround, such constant vigilance and control, never allowed to simply exist without intervention. And Emmeline felt something click into place, some understanding of what she needed to do next, what physical act was required to complete this transformation from silent victim to woman who made sound without fear. She left the library and walked through the house toward the conservatory, and as she moved through the corridors, she felt her pace quickening, felt her breath coming faster, felt anticipation building in her chest like pressure before an explosion, and by the time she reached the conservatory door, she was nearly running, was desperate to reach those perfect controlled flowers and tear them apart with her bare hands. The conservatory was exactly as it had been the night of her engagement party. Glass walls fogged with moisture, exotic blooms arranged in precise rows, the sickly sweet scent of jasmine overwhelming, every surface clean and controlled, and maintained with obsessive care, and Emmeline looked at it all with hatred so pure it felt like clarity, felt like purpose, felt like the most honest emotion she had ever experienced. She started with the nearest orchid, a prize specimen her mother had purchased from an explorer recently returned from the Far East, had paid an obscene amount of money for this one plant, had displayed it prominently, and boasted about its rarity and beauty, and Emmeline picked up the ceramic pot and threw it against the glass wall with all her strength, the sound of shattering pottery and cracking glass so loud and shocking that she gasped. And then she laughed, actually laughed out loud at the destruction, at the chaos, at the beautiful, terrible mess. She moved through the conservatory like a storm, smashing pots, tearing petals from stems, ripping plants from their careful arrangements and throwing them on the floor, grinding delicate roots into the tile with her heels. And with each act of destruction she made sound. She shouted, she cried, she laughed, she screamed, every noise she had suppressed for 26 years pouring out in a cacophony that must have been audible throughout the entire house, probably throughout the entire square, And she did not care, did not try to quiet herself, did not apologize or diminish or make herself smaller. She was covered in soil and water, her nightclothes and dressing gown filthy and torn, her hair wild and loose around her shoulders, her hands bleeding from broken pottery and sharp stems, and she had never felt more alive, more present, more fully herself than in this moment of complete destruction, of chaos, of loud, messy, undeniable expression of everything she had been taught to hide. The conservatory door flew open, and Lady Catherine stood in the doorway, her face white with shock and horror, staring at the ruins of her prize collection, at her daughter standing in the center of the destruction like some wild thing, like a force of nature, like something that could not be controlled or contained or forced back into acceptable bounds. "What have you done?" Lady Catherine whispered, her voice strangled with rage and disbelief. "You have destroyed everything, years of cultivation, thousands of pounds, my entire collection, you ungrateful, spiteful, terrible girl." Emmeline turned to face her mother, and she felt no fear, felt no automatic flinching or cowering or scrambling to apologize, felt only a calm certainty that this destruction was necessary, was right, was the physical manifestation of her internal liberation. "These flowers were like me," she said, her voice loud and clear and steady, despite the tears streaming down her face. Forced to survive in conditions too controlled, too perfect, never allowed to simply exist without constant intervention, you imported them from far away and made them perform beauty for your guests, made them symbols of your taste and refinement and wealth. And you did the same to me, imported me from childhood, and made me perform perfection, made me a symbol of your successful mothering, your proper daughter, your silent, obedient possession. Lady Catherine stepped into the conservatory, her shoes crunching on broken pottery. "You are hysterical," she said, attempting to reassert control. "You need more medicine. You need to rest. You do not know what you are saying." Emmeline laughed, a sound that bordered on manic, but felt gloriously free. "I know exactly what I am saying. I am saying that I am not your possession. I am not your redemption for whatever failures you believe you suffered in your own life. I am not your silence. I am not your carefully controlled orchid that exists only to make you look good. I am a person. A whole entire person with thoughts and feelings and desires and rage. So much rage that I have been swallowing for so long that it has poisoned me from the inside. But I am not swallowing it anymore. I am spitting it out. I am screaming it. I am destroying your perfect controlled symbols, and I am walking away." "You are ruined," Lady Catherine hissed, her composure finally cracking. "No one will receive you after this display. No respectable family will acknowledge you. You have thrown away everything I worked to build for you. And for what? For some deaf duke who can offer you nothing but social embarrassment and a life on the margins of society." Emmeline picked up one last orchid, a particularly beautiful specimen with delicate white petals, and she tore it apart slowly, deliberately, petal by petal, while maintaining eye contact with her mother. "I am finally free," she said quietly, each word weighted with meaning. "Your reception means nothing to me. Society's opinion means nothing to me. The only thing that matters is that I am claiming my own life, my own voice, my own right to exist loudly and messily and imperfectly. I choose Frederick because he sees me as I actually am and values me for it. But more importantly, I choose myself. I choose sound over silence. I choose expression over suppression. I choose life over the slow death you were forcing me toward." She dropped the torn petals and walked toward her mother, and Lady Catherine actually stepped back, actually flinched away from her daughter, as though Emmeline had become something dangerous, something unpredictable, something that could no longer be controlled through punishment and conditioning and carefully calibrated doses of laudanum. You taught me to cry without sound because my pain inconvenienced you," Emmeline said, stopping directly in front of her mother, close enough to see the fear and fury warring in those cold eyes. "You taught me that my feelings were less important than your comfort, that my worth was measured by my ability to disappear, to take up no space, to cause no disturbance. But I will never be silent again. I will cry loudly, I will laugh loudly, I will exist loudly. And if that inconveniences you, if that disturbs your perfect controlled world, then you are welcome to look away, because I am done performing for an audience that never valued me anyway." She walked past her mother, leaving the older woman standing alone among the ruins of her conservatory, among the shattered symbols of control and cultivation and forced perfection. And Emmeline felt no guilt, felt no regret, felt only a lightness that came from having finally broken her own chains, rather than waiting for someone else to free her. She walked through the house, making no attempt to clean herself or hide the evidence of what she had done, walked past servants who stared with open shock at her disheveled appearance, and the trail of soil and water she left on the expensive carpets, walked directly back to the drawing room where Frederick and his allies had been waiting, and when she entered the room, covered in dirt and blood and torn flower petals, wild-haired and tear-stained and radiantly, terrifyingly alive, Frederick rose to his feet with an expression of wonder and pride and love so obvious that it made her chest ache. She crossed the room to him and signed, her hands moving with more confidence than they ever had before. "I have destroyed my mother's orchids. I have screamed and cried and laughed without controlling the volume. I have claimed my voice and my sound and my right to exist fully. And now I am ready to answer your question. Yes, I will marry you. But first, teach me to live loudly. Teach me everything you know about choosing freedom every day. Teach me how to be fully alive rather than merely surviving. Teach me what it means to express rather than suppress." Frederick's eyes were wet with tears that he made no attempt to hide, and he signed back, his movements expansive and joyful. "Tomorrow. We can be married tomorrow if you wish, or in a year, or never if you decide you would prefer to be free without attaching yourself to another man. But whatever you choose, I will teach you everything I know about living loudly, about celebrating expression, about refusing to shrink yourself to fit into spaces too small for human souls. I will introduce you to the deaf community, who will embrace you as one of their own. I will support whatever you want to become, whoever you want to be, and I will never, ever ask you to be silent." Emmeline turned to the Duke of Brandon and spoke aloud, her voice still rough and unfamiliar in her own ears, but present, real, undeniable. "Tomorrow," she said. "I want to be married tomorrow. I have waited long enough to live. I have spent 26 years in a cage, and I do not want to waste another day. Please arrange whatever is necessary to make this happen as quickly as legally possible." The Duke of Brandon smiled, genuine warmth in his expression. "It will be my pleasure, Lady Emmeline. I will obtain a special license today. We can hold the ceremony tomorrow afternoon at my private chapel. Small and intimate. Witnesses only those you choose. No performance required, no society to please. Just two people choosing each other freely." Mrs. Morland approached and signed, her face alight with joy. "You have broken your chains. You have chosen freedom. You have become the woman you were always meant to be beneath all that imposed silence. Welcome to the community of the living. Welcome to the world of those who express fully and live loudly. We celebrate you. We honor your courage. We stamp our feet in approval of your transformation." Emmeline signed back, her movement still clumsy but improving. "Thank you for showing me another way to exist, for helping me understand that silence can be chosen rather than enforced. for applauding my scream when everyone else in my life would have punished it. I want to learn more. I want to become fluent in sign language. I want to be part of your community. I want to teach other hearing people that there are different ways to communicate, different ways to value each other beyond the words that come from mouths. Clara the maid had been standing near the doorway throughout this exchange, and now she stepped forward, her face wet with tears, and she curtsied deeply before speaking. "Miss Emmeline?" she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I am so proud of you. I have watched you suffer for years, watched you cry silently in your room after enduring your mother's cruelty, watched you shrink and diminish yourself to fit into the role they demanded, and I have wished so many times that you would find the courage to fight back, to claim your own life. Seeing you now, covered in soil and wild and free, is the most beautiful thing I have ever witnessed. I am honored to have played even a small part in helping you reach this moment." Emmeline crossed to her maid and pulled her into an embrace, something that would have been considered impossibly inappropriate just hours earlier, but now felt like the only possible response. "Thank you," she whispered into Clara's ear. "Thank you for smuggling my letter to Frederick. Thank you for the small kindnesses over the years. Thank you for being the only person in this house who ever looked at me with compassion rather than judgment. When I leave tomorrow, will you come with me? Will you join my household as my companion? Rather than my servant, I want people around me who choose to be there rather than people bound by duty or social obligation." Clara pulled back with shocked delight. "Yes," she said immediately. "Yes, I would be honored. I would love nothing more than to leave this house and start fresh somewhere new, with someone who values kindness and honesty over performance and control." Outside the drawing-room windows, the sky had darkened with the approach of a spring storm, thunder rumbling in the distance, and as Emmeline stood surrounded by these people who had helped her break free, who had offered her choice rather than chains, who celebrated her transformation rather than punishing her expression, the first fat raindrops began to fall, pelting against the glass with increasing intensity, and she felt as though the weather itself was responding to her emotional release, as though the universe was acknowledging the magnitude of what had just happened, the walls that had crumbled, the light that had flooded in. The woman who had died silently for 26 years and was now being born loudly into a future she would build herself. Frederick approached and took her hands again, and he spoke aloud, his voice unmodulated in the way of someone who cannot hear himself, but full of warmth and conviction. "I love you," he said, the words slightly slurred but perfectly understandable. "I love your intelligence and your passion and your courage and your determination to be fully alive. I love that you destroyed those orchids. I love that you screamed and cried and claimed your voice. I love who you are when you are not performing for an audience that does not deserve you. And I promise that I will spend every day for the rest of our lives helping you discover more of who you can be when you are free." Emmeline looked at him, this man who had seen her when no one else had bothered to look, who had valued her mind and her feelings and her authentic self, who had offered her choice rather than control, who had knelt before her and waited patiently while she broke her own chains. And she felt love blooming in her chest. Not the desperate attachment of someone seeking rescue, but the genuine affection of someone who had been truly seen and valued. And she spoke back, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I love you too," she said. "I love that you do not see your deafness as a deficit, but as a difference. I love that you belong to a community that celebrates expression. I love that you have been patient while I learned to be free. I love that you offered me choice rather than simply taking me from one cage to another. And I promise that I will spend every day learning to live more loudly, more fully, more authentically, and I will never again apologize for taking up space in the world." The storm broke fully then, rain pouring down in sheets, thunder cracking overhead, lightning illuminating the drawing room in brilliant flashes. And through it all, Emmeline stood covered in soil and water and torn petals, holding Frederick's hands, surrounded by people who had chosen to help her rather than hurt her. And she laughed, loud and free and unrestrained, the sound of someone who had finally broken through the silence that had nearly killed her. Someone who had chosen freedom even when it was terrifying. Someone who had destroyed the symbols of her captivity and walked away from the cage, even though she did not yet fully know who she would become without it. And the sound of that laughter, loud and messy and perfectly imperfect, was the sound of a woman claiming her own life, her own voice, her own right to exist fully and loudly and without apology. And it was, she thought, the most beautiful sound she had ever made. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the East Wing Conservatory at Wentworth Hall, illuminating a scene so different from the one Emmeline had known in her mother's house that it might have belonged to another world entirely, another lifetime, another woman who bore only superficial resemblance to the silent, suppressed creature she had been just 3 months earlier. The conservatory here was not a shrine to controlled perfection, but a working studio. Tables covered with watercolor palettes and botanical specimens, easels holding half-finished paintings, and most importantly, children, 8 of them ranging in age from 7 to 14, all deaf, all bent over their work with expressions of fierce concentration, broken occasionally by laughter and animated signed conversations that filled the air with movement and life. Emmeline moved among them with easy grace, her hair pulled back in a simple style that would have horrified her mother. Her dress, practical rather than fashionable, covered with a paint-stained apron, and she laughed loudly and frequently, a sound that still sometimes surprised her with its volume and freedom, as she corrected a student's brush technique or praised particularly clever use of color, her hands flying through signs with increasing fluency, her face animated with the kind of unguarded expression that would once have earned her a sharp reprimand, but now earned her the children's trust and affection. She was demonstrating how to capture the translucent quality of a rose petal. When young Emma, a girl of 10 who had been born deaf to hearing parents who had largely given up trying to communicate with her, tugged on Emmeline's sleeve and signed a question about whether it was acceptable to make mistakes, whether perfection was required for the paintings to be valuable. Emmeline knelt beside the child's easel and signed back slowly, clearly, her expression earnest. "Your hands can say anything your heart feels," she signed, "and the same is true of your art. It does not need to be perfect to be valuable. It only needs to be honest, to show what you see and feel and think. Mistakes are part of learning, part of being human. Never let anyone silence you or make you feel that you must be perfect to deserve to take up space in the world. You are worthy exactly as you are, mistakes and all." The child's face lit with understanding and relief, and she returned to her painting with renewed confidence, and Emmeline felt a warmth in her chest that she had come to recognize as purpose, as meaning, as the satisfaction that came from using her knowledge and skills to help others rather than merely performing accomplishments to make herself marriageable. The school had been Frederick's idea, proposed on their wedding night when they had lain together in the peaceful darkness, his hand resting on her throat so he could feel her voice as she told him about her dreams for the future, about wanting to use her botanical knowledge for something more than personal satisfaction, and he had signed back with enthusiasm about establishing a school on the Wentworth estate where deaf children from London could come for extended visits, could learn not just academics, but practical skills like scientific illustration that might allow them to support themselves in a world that often refused to employ deaf workers. They had been married for 3 months now, and in that time, Emmeline had experienced more genuine happiness than in all her previous 26 years combined, had discovered what it meant to wake each morning without dread, to move through her days without the constant vigilance required to monitor and suppress every feeling, to go to sleep at night, beside someone who valued her authentic self rather than her ability to perform contentment. Their wedding had been nothing like the grand society affair her mother had been planning with Edmund, had been instead a small, intimate ceremony at the Deaf Church in Bermondsey, attended by perhaps 30 people, all of them either deaf themselves or closely connected to the deaf community, and the vows had been exchanged entirely in sign language, Frederick's hands moving with practiced fluency, and Emmeline's with determined effort, still learning but improving rapidly. And when they had sealed their promises with a kiss, the congregation had applauded not with polite clapping, but with vigorous foot-stamping that made the wooden floors vibrate, the deaf way of showing approval and joy. Lady Catherine had not attended, had in fact refused to acknowledge the marriage at all, had sent a cold letter through her solicitor formally severing all connection with her disobedient daughter, and Emmeline had read that letter with something between grief and relief, mourning the mother she had wished for but never had, while celebrating her freedom from the woman who had actually raised her. And she had burned the letter in the library fireplace, with Frederick's arm around her shoulders, had watched the paper curl and blacken and disappear, and had felt another chain breaking, another door closing on her old life. The Duke of Brandon had attended the wedding, had given Emmeline away in the absence of any family willing to perform that role, and Mrs. Beatrice Morland had stood beside her as witness, and Clara had wept happy tears throughout the ceremony, and afterward there had been a feast at the Bermondsey Asylum, where deaf and hearing people had celebrated together, signing and speaking and laughing and eating, and Emmeline had felt for the first time in her life that she belonged somewhere, that she was part of a community that valued her for who she actually was, rather than who she could pretend to be. She was pulled from her memories by a touch on her shoulder, and she turned to find Frederick standing behind her, his expression warm with affection and quiet pride. And he signed, "The children are doing beautiful work. You are an excellent teacher. They trust you in a way they would never trust most hearing people, because they can see that you understand what it means to be silenced, to have your expression suppressed. You speak their language even though your deafness is metaphorical rather than literal." Emmeline signed back, "I am still learning. My signing is clumsy compared to yours or Beatrice's. But the children are patient with me. They seem to understand that I am trying, that I value their language and their community, that I am not attempting to fix them or make them more like hearing people, but rather to help them develop their own strengths and abilities." Frederick moved closer, his hand coming up to brush a streak of paint from her cheek, and he signed one-handed, his other hand still cupped against her face. "You have become fluent in more than sign language. You have become fluent in the language of freedom, of expression, of living loudly without apology, watching you with these children, seeing you laugh and gesture and take up space without shrinking yourself, is the greatest joy of my life. You are exactly who I hoped you would become when I first saw you crying silently in the library. Except you are even more than I imagined, more vibrant, more alive, more fully yourself." She felt tears gathering in her eyes, the happy kind, the kind that came from overwhelming gratitude and love rather than pain or grief. And she signed back, "You gave me the gift of seeing myself differently, of understanding that my silence was not serenity, but suppression, of learning that there were other ways to exist in the world. I will spend the rest of my life grateful for that gift, for you, for this life we are building together." The children had finished their paintings and were cleaning their brushes, signing to each other about which pieces they wanted to work on next session, and Emmeline moved among them, offering praise and gentle corrections, reminding them to care for their materials properly. And when the lesson ended and the children filed out with their caretakers, heading toward the dining room for lunch, Frederick and Emmeline were left alone in the sun-filled conservatory, surrounded by the evidence of creative expression and learning, and she turned to him with a smile that felt like it might split her face, so wide and genuine and unguarded. He pulled her close, and they stood together in comfortable silence for a long moment, her head resting against his chest, his arms wrapped around her, and she could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong, and she thought about how much of their communication happened without words or signs, happened through touch and presence, and the kind of attention that came from truly seeing each other, truly valuing each other, truly choosing each other every day. That evening, in their private quarters on the second floor of Wentworth Hall, Emmeline sat at her writing desk finishing correspondence, while Frederick reviewed architectural plans for the expansion of the school. They hoped to add a dedicated science laboratory and an additional dormitory wing that would allow them to accommodate more students, and the comfortable domesticity of the scene filled her with contentment. This was what marriage could be, she had learned. This partnership of equals working toward shared goals, this mutual support and respect, this freedom to be fully oneself without performance or pretense. Frederick looked up from his plans and studied her face with that intense attention he always showed, reading something in her expression, and he rose and crossed to her desk. Signing, "What are you thinking about? You look happy but also contemplative. Tell me what is in your heart." Emmeline set down her pen and turned to face him fully, and as she did, tears began streaming down her face, and Frederick's expression immediately shifted to concern, his hands moving to cup her face, feeling the moisture there, signing anxiously, "What is wrong? What has happened? Why are you crying?" She laughed through her tears and signed back, "These are happy tears. I am crying because I am happy, because I am sitting here in our home doing work that matters, surrounded by evidence of the life we are building, and I am overwhelmed with gratitude, with love, with the sheer impossibility of having gone from that silent, dying woman in my mother's house to this person who laughs loudly and teaches children and lives without fear. It seems impossible that this is my life now, and yet it is, and I am crying because happiness can be as overwhelming as grief, can fill you just as completely, can demand expression just as urgently." Frederick's face softened with understanding, and he signed, his movements gentle and tender, "I feel every one of your tears. Tell me everything. Share with me all the happiness and gratitude and overwhelming feeling. I want to know every thought in your beautiful mind, every emotion in your fierce heart." They moved to the small sofa near the fireplace, settling together with the ease of people who had learned each other's bodies, each other's rhythms, each other's needs, and Emmeline began signing, telling him about her day, about the children's progress, about young Emma's question about perfection, about the way teaching allowed her to process her own experiences and transform them into something helpful for others who had been silenced in different ways. And Frederick watched her hands with complete attention, occasionally signing questions or comments, and the conversation flowed between them like water, natural and necessary and beautiful. She paused, her hands stilling for a moment, and then she signed something she had been waiting for the right moment to share. "There is something else, something I learned today that adds to my overwhelming happiness. I visited the doctor in the village this morning while you were meeting with the architect, and he confirmed what I suspected. I am pregnant. We are going to have a child." Frederick's face went through a rapid succession of expressions: surprise, joy, wonder, slight fear, and then overwhelming happiness, and he pulled her into an embrace so tight she could barely breathe. And when he pulled back, his hands were shaking as he signed, "A child. We are going to be parents. This is, I do not even have words, signed or spoken, to express what I feel. This is everything. This is the future continuing. This is our love made physical. This is terrifying and wonderful and perfect. Emmeline signed back, smiling through fresh tears. I am terrified too. I do not know how to be a mother. I only know how not to be one. I only know what my mother did wrong and what damage it caused, but I want to try. I want to raise our child to express freely, to make sound without fear, to understand that they are valuable exactly as they are, whether they can hear or not, whether they are perfect or not, whether they please society or not. I want to give them the childhood I never had, the freedom to be fully themselves. Frederick's response was immediate and emphatic. We will give them that childhood together. We will teach them sign language and spoken language. We will teach them that there are many ways to communicate, and none is superior to the others. We will teach them that disability is not tragedy, but simply difference. We will teach them to value expression over suppression, community over isolation, authentic connection over social performance, and most importantly, we will teach them that they are loved unconditionally, not for what they accomplish or how well they behave, but simply for existing, for being themselves, for being ours. They sat together planning the future, discussing whether they would hire a deaf nurse or a hearing one or both, debating whether they should expand the school before the baby came or wait until after, wondering whether the child would be deaf or hearing and agreeing that they would love and support them either way. And through it all, Emmeline felt a peace she had never imagined possible, a sense that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do, with exactly the right person beside her. Frederick signed. You have taught me something profound, something I did not fully understand before I met you. You have taught me that feeling is louder than sound, that the deepest communication happens not through ears, but through attention, through presence, through the willingness to truly see another person and value what you find there. I have been deaf since I was 14, and I thought I understood silence. But you taught me that there are different kinds of silence. The silence I live in is chosen, is peaceful, is full of meaning communicated through hands and faces and bodies. But the silence you lived in was enforced, was violent, was a prison that nearly killed you, and learning the difference has made me appreciate my deafness in new ways, has made me grateful for the deaf community that taught me I was not broken, but simply different, has made me want to ensure that no one else has to experience the kind of silencing you endured. Emmeline felt fresh tears streaming down her face, and she signed back, her movements expansive and passionate. You have taught me equally profound things. You have taught me that rescue is not about being saved by someone else, but about being given the tools and support to save yourself. You offered me choice rather than control. You showed me another world, but you made me walk into it myself. You did not carry me across the threshold of freedom. You held the door open and waited while I gathered the courage to step through, and that made all the difference, because it meant that my freedom was something I claimed rather than something that was given to me. And claimed freedom is so much more powerful than granted freedom. It cannot be taken away as easily, because it comes from inside rather than being imposed from outside. They talked long into the night, signing in the firelight, occasionally speaking aloud to feel the vibrations of voice and laughter, touching frequently, maintaining the constant physical contact that had become natural to them, necessary to them, part of how they expressed love and connection and partnership. And when they finally went to bed, they lay together in the darkness, Frederick's hand resting on Emmeline's still flat stomach, feeling for the life growing there even though it was far too early for movement, And Emmeline placed her hand over his, and she spoke aloud into the darkness, knowing he could not hear her, but needing to say it anyway, needing to give voice to the gratitude and love that filled her so completely. "I learned to cry without making sound," she said softly, her voice no longer afraid of volume, but choosing quiet in this intimate moment. "I learned that silence could be survival, that suppressing myself was the price of being allowed to exist. And then I met you, and I learned that silence could be chosen rather than enforced, that there was a whole community of people who lived in silence by necessity, but expressed themselves more fully than most, hearing people ever do. And then I learned that love hears what sound cannot carry, that the deepest communication happens through attention and presence and the willingness to truly see each other. And now I am teaching children what you taught me. That expression is a right, not a privilege, that silence is only oppressive when it is forced, that there are 1,000 ways to communicate, and none of them require making yourself small or quiet or acceptable to people who do not value you anyway." She felt Frederick's hand tighten on her stomach, felt him shift closer, felt his lips press against her temple. And though he could not hear her words, she knew he understood her meaning, knew he felt her love and gratitude and overwhelming happiness through the language of touch, through the vibration of her voice against his skin, through the peaceful silence they had chosen together, a silence that was not empty but full, not enforced but freely given, not a prison but a sanctuary. And in that silence, Emmeline finally, fully understood what Frederick had been trying to teach her from that first morning in the library, that being heard had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with being truly seen, truly valued, truly loved, for exactly who you were, beneath all the performance and pretense. And she had been heard, had been seen, had been loved. And in return, she had learned to hear not with ears, but with heart, to see not just surfaces, but depths, to love not the performance, but the person. And that, she thought as sleep finally claimed her, was the greatest transformation of all, not learning to make sound, but learning to value what sound could never fully express, the profound connection between two people who had learned each other's language, who had chosen each other freely, who had built together a life based not on silence or sound, but on the kind of communication that transcended both, the language of genuine attention, of authentic presence, of unconditional love. And it was, she knew, the most beautiful language she would ever learn. The Royal Exhibition Hall in Kensington blazed with afternoon sunlight, streaming through tall arched windows, illuminating the botanical artwork that lined the walls in gilded frames, and Emmeline stood in the entrance with her husband beside her and her infant daughter cradled in her arms, taking in the glittering crowd of society's finest, who had come to view the unprecedented collection of scientific illustrations by British artists, including, for the first time in the exhibition's history, work by a married woman whose name appeared in full beneath her paintings rather than hidden behind the anonymity of her husband's title. She wore a dress of deep emerald silk that brought out the color in her eyes, a shade her mother would have declared too bold, too attention-seeking, too inappropriate for a lady who should blend into the background like a watercolor wash. But Emmeline had chosen it, deliberately, had stood before the mirror in her dressing room that morning and smiled at her own reflection, at this woman who wore vibrant colors and laughed openly and signed with her hands even while speaking, and made no effort whatsoever to diminish herself, to make others comfortable. 18 months had passed since the morning she had destroyed her mother's conservatory and walked out of the Dashwood townhouse covered in soil and torn petals. 18 months since she had married Frederick in the Duke of Brandon's private chapel with only a handful of witnesses present. 18 months since she had begun the slow, difficult, exhilarating work of learning to live loudly, to express fully, to exist without apology or shame or the constant fear that making sound would result in punishment. Those months had been spent primarily at Frederick's country estate in Kent, far from London's prying eyes and endless social obligations, in a household that operated by different rules than the ones Emmeline had grown up with, where servants were treated with respect rather than invisible obedience, where the deaf members of the staff communicated freely in sign language, where expression was celebrated and authenticity valued above performance, where Emmeline had slowly, gradually learned to trust that she would not be punished for taking up space, for having opinions, for crying loudly when she needed to cry, and laughing loudly when she needed to laugh, and sometimes just sitting in chosen silence that was peaceful rather than enforced. She had spent those months working on her botanical illustrations with a focus and dedication that would have been impossible in her mother's house, had expanded beyond orchids to document the wild flowers and herbs and trees of the Kent countryside, had developed a style that combined scientific accuracy with artistic beauty in ways that caught the attention of the Royal Botanical Society. When Frederick, proud of his wife's talent, had submitted a portfolio of her work without telling her, and the letter inviting her to display at the exhibition had made her cry, had made her scream with joy, had made her dance around their morning room while Frederick watched with delight, and their 3-month-old daughter, named Beatrice in honor of Mrs. Morland, who had become a dear friend and frequent visitor, gurgled happily from her cradle. The invitation to exhibit had also meant returning to London, facing the society that had once defined her worth entirely by her marriageability and her ability to perform acceptable femininity, facing her mother, who had not spoken to her since the wedding, who had attended the ceremony with a face like carved stone and left immediately afterward without offering congratulations or acknowledgement, who had apparently spent the intervening months telling anyone who would listen that her daughter had been seduced and manipulated by a disabled man who preyed on vulnerable young women, and Emmeline had been terrified of this return, had lain awake nights worrying that seeing her mother again would undo all her progress, would send her spiraling back into silence and submission. But Frederick had held her and reminded her that she was not the same woman who had left London, that she had spent 18 months practicing freedom, that she could choose to leave at any moment if the experience became too much, and his confidence in her had given her the courage to accept the invitation, to prepare her work for display, to pack her vibrant dresses and her sleeping daughter, and return to face the world that had nearly destroyed her. Now, standing in the exhibition hall surrounded by the cream of London society, Emmeline felt remarkably calm, felt grounded in her body in a way she never had before, felt Frederick's steady presence beside her like an anchor, felt baby Beatrice's warm weight in her arms like a reminder of the future she had built rather than the past she had escaped. And she moved forward into the crowd with her head high and a genuine smile on her face that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with authentic pleasure at seeing her work displayed so beautifully, so publicly, so proudly under her own name. The reaction to her arrival rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water, people turning to stare at the Duchess of Wentworth, who had caused such scandal 18 months ago by breaking her engagement mere days before the wedding, by marrying instead a deaf duke, by disappearing to the country and refusing all social invitations, by living entirely outside the bounds of acceptable society. And the whispers started immediately, the sort of vicious gossip that would have destroyed Emmeline once upon a time, but now merely amused her. She could see the matrons leaning together and speculating about whether the child was truly the Duke's, or perhaps conceived before the wedding. Could see the young ladies eyeing her dress with envy and disapproval in equal measure, could see the gentlemen assessing her with the sort of calculation that suggested they were wondering if a woman who had defied convention once might be persuaded to do so again in ways that would benefit them. Frederick could not hear the whispers, but he could read the room's energy through visual cues, through the way people shifted and stared and leaned toward each other, and he signed to Emmeline with a wry smile. "They are talking about us. Should we give them something more interesting to discuss? Perhaps I could kiss you scandalously in the middle of the exhibition hall." Emmeline laughed aloud, a sound that turned more heads, and she signed back while speaking, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet space. "I think my botanical illustrations are scandal enough for one day, but I appreciate the offer. Perhaps we can save the scandalous kissing for later, when we have fewer witnesses." The sight of the Duchess both speaking and signing simultaneously seemed to confuse many observers, who clearly did not understand why she would bother with hand movements when her husband could simply read her lips. But Emmeline had learned over the past months that signing while speaking helped her feel more fully expressed, helped her engage her whole body in communication rather than just her voice, helped her stay grounded and present rather than retreating into the old patterns of disconnection and performance. She moved toward the wall where her work was displayed, and as she approached, she felt her breath catch at the sight of her paintings mounted in elegant frames. The botanical illustrations she had created in stolen hours and hidden away from her mother's disapproval, now displayed for all of London to see, each one labelled with a brass plaque that read, "Lady Emmeline Wentworth, Duchess of Wentworth," and seeing her name there, her own name rather than merely her husband's title, her identity claimed publicly rather than subsumed into marriage, made tears spring to her eyes, the happy kind of tears that she had learned to distinguish from the pain kind, the release kind, the rage kind, all the different emotional expressions that she had once compressed into silent weeping, but now could identify and honor as distinct experiences. A society matron approached, Lady Pemberton, who had been at Emmeline's disastrous engagement party 18 months ago, who had mistaken her silent tears for joy, and the older woman's expression was a complicated mixture of pity and curiosity and barely concealed judgment. "Duchess," she said, her tone suggesting she was doing Emmeline a great favor by acknowledging her at all. "What a surprise to see you returned to London, and with an infant no less. Such courage you must have, managing a household and a child with a deaf husband. I confess I do not know how you cope. It must be terribly difficult communicating with someone so afflicted. You are to be commended for your patience and sacrifice." Emmeline felt Frederick tense slightly beside her, felt his hand on her waist tighten, and she knew he had read enough of Lady Pemberton's lips to understand the condescension in her words, the pity that positioned him as burden rather than partner, and she felt a flash of protective fury on his behalf, on behalf of the deaf community that had welcomed her so warmly, on behalf of everyone who had ever been told their way of existing was lesser simply because it was different. She shifted Beatrice in her arms and met Lady Pemberton's eyes steadily, her voice clear and firm and entirely without the apologetic tone that would have colored it 18 months ago. "Such blessing I have," she said, each word deliberate and weighted with meaning. "My husband hears me better than any hearing man ever has. He feels every tear on my face and every joy in my heart. He sees me completely and values what he sees. He has taught me that sound is not the only language of love, that being heard has nothing to do with noise and everything to do with being truly seen. I have never been happier, never been more fully myself, never been more grateful for the life I have built, and I would not trade it for anything." Lady Pemberton looked taken aback by this passionate defense, clearly expecting Emmeline to demur or make self-deprecating remarks about managing as best she could, and she opened her mouth to respond, but Emmeline had already turned away, had dismissed the conversation as finished, had chosen to spend her attention on her artwork rather than on someone whose judgment meant nothing to her, and the power of that choice, the freedom of simply walking away from a conversation that did not serve her, made her feel strong in a way that would have been impossible before Frederick taught her that she could choose where to direct her energy, that she was not obligated to engage with everyone who demanded her attention. Frederick had watched the entire exchange, and now he signed to her with pride evident in his expression. "You were magnificent. You did not apologize. You did not diminish yourself. You stood firm in your truth. I am so proud of the woman you have become, the woman you were always meant to be beneath all that imposed silence." Emmeline signed back, one-handed since Beatrice occupied the other arm. "I learned from the best. You taught me that I do not owe anyone my performance, that I can simply be authentic and let them be uncomfortable with it if they choose. It is remarkably freeing to stop trying to manage other people's feelings about my existence." They moved along the wall, examining her illustrations, and Emmeline found herself surrounded by admirers who appreciated her work for its scientific accuracy and artistic merit, botanists and artists and scholars who asked intelligent questions about her techniques and her subjects, who treated her as a serious artist rather than a dabbling aristocrat, and she engaged with them enthusiastically, speaking and signing simultaneously, her whole body involved in the communication, and she felt more alive, more present, more genuinely connected to these strangers who valued her work than she had ever felt in years of stilted social conversation in her mother's drawing room. Across the room, she caught sight of her mother standing alone near the entrance, Lady Catherine dressed in her usual severe style, her face carefully composed into an expression of polite interest that did not quite hide the bitterness beneath. And Emmeline felt a complex swirl of emotions, pity and anger and grief and relief all mixed together, because her mother looked diminished somehow, looked smaller and older and lonelier than Emmeline remembered. And she understood with sudden clarity that Lady Catherine's cruelty had come from her own cage, from her own silenced suffering, from her own inability to imagine freedom. And while this understanding did not excuse what her mother had done, did not erase the years of abuse and control, it did allow Emmeline to feel something other than pure rage when she looked at the woman who had given birth to her and then spent decades trying to crush everything vital out of her. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and Lady Catherine's expression flickered, something vulnerable showing through the careful mask, for just a moment before being ruthlessly suppressed. And Emmeline saw in that flicker the echo of her own old pain, the learned silence, the swallowed feelings, the performance of contentment while dying inside. And she felt a wave of pity for her mother, for this woman who had never learned to break her own chains, who had transferred her suffering onto her daughter rather than fighting for freedom, who would die in the cage she had built for herself because she lacked the courage or the support or the imagination to envision anything different. But pity did not mean obligation, did not mean reconciliation, did not mean allowing her mother back into her life to potentially harm her or her daughter or the peace she had worked so hard to build. And Emmeline held her mother's gaze for a long moment, acknowledged the pain they shared, acknowledged the cycle of trauma that Lady Catherine had perpetuated, and then she deliberately turned away, chose to focus on the people who celebrated her rather than the person who had spent years trying to destroy her. And in that turning away, she felt the final thread of her mother's control snap, felt herself fully free in a way she had not quite achieved until this moment of choosing to walk away. Not in fear or anger, but in calm recognition that some relationships are too poisonous to maintain, that she had no obligation to set herself on fire to keep her mother warm. She moved deeper into the exhibition hall, and as she turned a corner, she came face to face with Edmund Whitmore, Viscount Whitmore, who stood before one of her paintings looking wan and tired and significantly older than his 34 years. And beside him stood Lydia, no longer golden and glowing but pinched and bitter, wearing a dress that had been expensive once but now showed signs of wear, and the couple looked at each other with the sort of mutual resentment that spoke of years of disappointment compressed into 18 short months. Edmund's eyes widened when he saw Emmeline, and something like longing flashed across his face, not for her specifically, but for what she represented, for the money he had lost when the engagement was broken, for the comfortable future that had evaporated when his debts became public knowledge, and his reputation was ruined by Frederick's carefully deployed evidence of fraud and infidelity. "Emmeline," he said, attempting to infuse his voice with warmth that rang completely false. "You look well. Marriage clearly agrees with you. I had hoped we might have a moment to speak, to perhaps clear the air between us. We were friends once. Before everything became so complicated." Emmeline looked at him, at this man who had kissed her cousin in the garden while engaged to her, who had struck her face and whispered crude threats about their wedding night, who had seen her as nothing more than a financial convenience and a body to use as he pleased, and she felt nothing, no anger, no pain, no fear, no curiosity about what he might want to say, only a mild detachment, as though looking at a stranger who had no connection to her life whatsoever. She shifted Beatrice in her arms, the weight of her daughter grounding her, reminding her of everything she had built in the space where Edmund's cruelty might have destroyed her if she had not found the courage to escape, and she spoke with perfect calm and absolute finality. "I am well, Lord Whitmore. I wish you good day." The dismissal was complete, was delivered without emotion or elaboration, without any opening for further conversation, and she walked past him without waiting for a response, moved past Lydia, who watched with obvious envy, and she did not look back, did not wonder what they thought or felt or wanted, did not spare them another thought beyond a vague sense of relief that she had escaped the future they represented, the slow death of silent suffering in a marriage based on lies and financial necessity and mutual contempt. Frederick caught up to her near the center of the exhibition hall, where a large canvas displayed her most ambitious work, a detailed illustration of an ancient oak tree, with every leaf and branch and root rendered in exquisite detail. And he signed, "I saw you speak with your former betrothed. Are you well? Did he upset you?" Emmeline signed back with a genuine smile. "I am perfectly well. He is nothing to me now, less than nothing. A stranger whose path I once nearly followed to my own destruction. I feel no anger toward him, only gratitude that I escaped, only relief that my life is nothing like what it would have been if I had married him, only joy that I chose you instead, chose freedom instead, chose life instead of slow death." Frederick pulled her close, mindful of Beatrice between them, and he kissed her forehead, a gesture of tenderness and respect and deep abiding love. And around them, the society matrons gasped and whispered about such public displays of affection, about how the deaf duke had no sense of proper behavior, about how the duchess should be mortified by such attention. But Emmeline only laughed, only leaned into her husband's embrace, only felt grateful for a man who showed his love openly, rather than hiding it behind propriety and performance. They stood together before her artwork, and Frederick signed, "Are you happy we came? Are you glad you returned to London? Was it too difficult facing your past?" Emmeline looked around the exhibition hall, at the glittering crowd that had once defined her entire world, at the people who still lived in cages of propriety and performance, who still measured their worth by society's approval, who still swallowed their feelings and maintained pleasant expressions while dying slowly inside. And she understood that she had needed this return, had needed to see that she was free while they remained imprisoned, had needed to prove to herself that her transformation was real and lasting, that she could face her past without being pulled back into it, that she had built a life that was genuinely better than anything this world could have offered her if she had stayed silent and obedient and trapped. Yes, she signed back to Frederick, her movements expansive and confident. I am happy we came. I needed to see that I am free, that they are all still in cages they built themselves. I needed to stand in this room as myself, fully myself, loud and colorful and unashamed, and feel no fear, no desire to shrink, no impulse to apologize for existing. I needed this closure, this proof that I have truly escaped, that I am living rather than merely surviving. Baby Beatrice stirred in her arms and made a small sound, and Emmeline looked down at her daughter, at this tiny person who would grow up in a household where expression was celebrated, where crying was allowed, where making sound was encouraged rather than punished, where she would learn sign language alongside spoken English, where she would see her father's deafness not as disability, but as difference, where she would be taught that being heard had nothing to do with volume, and everything to do with being truly seen. And Emmeline felt such overwhelming love and gratitude for this child, for this future that looked nothing like her own past, for the chance to break the cycle of trauma and control, to raise a daughter who would never have to learn to cry without making sound. The afternoon sun shifted, streaming through the tall windows at a new angle, illuminating Emmeline's botanical illustrations with golden light, and she thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the conservatory where she had witnessed Edmund's betrayal to the library, where Frederick had first noticed her silent tears, from the bright room in Bermondsey where she had screamed for the first time, to the destroyed orchids that had symbolized her breaking chains, from the small private chapel where she had married Frederick, to the country estate where she had slowly learned to live loudly, and finally, to this moment, standing in the Royal Exhibition Hall with her husband beside her and her daughter in her arms, and her artwork displayed under her own name, proof that she had not only survived, but thrived, that she had transformed from silent victim to empowered woman, that she had claimed her voice and her life and her right to exist fully and without apology. She thought about the title that had defined her journey, about learning to cry without making sound because silence was survival, about the years of swallowing her feelings to avoid punishment, about the training that had taught her to die quietly so as not to inconvenience anyone with her pain. And she thought about Frederick, about the deaf Duke who could not hear her tears, but who felt every single one on her face, who had taught her that being heard was about being seen, about being valued, about being loved for her authentic self rather than her ability to perform contentment. And she understood that the real miracle of their relationship was not that he had rescued her, though he had helped her escape, but that he had taught her to rescue herself, had shown her that she had always had the power to choose freedom, had simply needed someone to believe in her enough that she could begin to believe in herself. As the afternoon wore on, as more admirers approached to discuss her work, as Frederick translated for deaf visitors who appreciated her art and her fluent signing, as baby Beatrice slept peacefully in her arms, Emmeline felt a deep sense of completion, of having come full circle, of having returned to the world that had nearly destroyed her, and discovering that it no longer had any power over her, that she had built something stronger and truer and more beautiful than anything this glittering society could offer, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would never again cry without making sound unless she chose to, that she would never again silence herself to make others comfortable, that she would never again accept a cage when she could choose freedom, because she had learned, finally and completely, that being heard had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with being seen, and she was seen, deeply and truly seen, by her husband and her chosen community, and most importantly by herself. And in being seen, she had been heard in ways that transcended noise, had been valued in ways that transformed her life, had been loved in ways that made her whole. The exhibition would continue for weeks. Her artwork would be discussed and admired, and eventually purchased by the Royal Botanical Society for their permanent collection. Her name would become known in scientific and artistic circles as a serious illustrator rather than a dabbling aristocrat, and she would continue to work, to create, to document the natural world with precision and passion. But in this moment, standing in the golden afternoon light with Frederick beside her and Beatrice in her arms, Emmeline felt only gratitude, only joy, only the deep, bone-certain knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be, living exactly the life she was meant to live, loving and being loved in return, free and loud and unashamed. And the tears that fell now were happy ones, were tears of relief and triumph and overwhelming emotion. And she made no attempt to hide them, made no attempt to cry without sound, because she had learned, she had finally learned, after 26 years of silence and 18 months of freedom, that her tears were valid, that her feelings mattered, that her voice deserved to be heard whether through sound or sign or art, or simply the authentic expression of her genuine self. And she was heard, she was seen, she was free, she was loved. And that, she thought, as Frederick wiped a tear from her cheek, and smiled at her with such tenderness, it made her heart ache. That was everything. That was the whole world. That was the life she had chosen and fought for and built from the ruins of the cage she had destroyed. And it was beautiful, and it was hers, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything she had ever needed and more than she had ever dared to dream possible. And she would spend the rest of her life honoring that gift, protecting that freedom, and teaching her daughter and anyone else who would listen that silence could be chosen rather than enforced, that being heard transcended sound, and that the most important voice to honor was the one that lived inside your own heart, the one that knew your truth, the one that deserved to be expressed fully and loudly and without apology, no matter what the world might say, no matter who might be uncomfortable, no matter how much easier it might seem to return to the cage and die quietly rather than live loudly and risk everything for the chance to be authentically, completely, gloriously free.